Three. This is our first guest episode with my dad, um, which sounds like I'm just pulling people to come on, but he's actually qualified, I would say. So, we're gonna be talking about
Daz doesn't go out of his
here. I'll
house.
read.
You
I'll
can't meet
read.
anybody to come on the podcast.
I'll read the title that my dad had me write. The Authoritarian Slide Part One: Institutional Rot. That is what we are talking about.
R1.
Oh yeah, for sure. This is gonna be multi-part. Okay.
Okay.
Um, Yeah, I really don't think I have many introductions. That's
How
about
about
it.
you introduce yourself, Mr. Walker?
Oh, okay. Uh, yeah. So Jazz told me he wanted me to do some podcasts on the risk that we're facing about losing our democracy now, and the possibility that we will slide into authoritarianism, or most likely, as a version of authoritarianism, it would be autocratic oligarchy. So I've talked to Jazz about this kind of stuff on a here and there basis. Have him watch videos and have discussions. That's part of his homeschooling. He's taken an interest in politics, so he started this podcast, and so we talk about things from time to time, and that's one of the things we've talked about. So he wanted me to discuss it with you guys. So, from as far as I'm concerned, you can interrupt whenever you want to ask questions or make comments or pick things that you want to discuss. Um, what do you want me to do, Jazz? You want me to just like lay it out there, or
Yeah, however you wanted to. You were gonna start it with a hook, right?
with
Essentially,
the what?
a hook.
A
You
hook?
remember
Oh,
when
this,
you explained
yeah,
the
the whole
different way?
podcast is the
Yeah.
hook.
Okay. Well, yeah. Just start it however you want to. I don't really have anything else to say.
Okay. So, what I want to talk about is the institutional traditions that we have and how they're breaking down now. Um, Overall, I think we're at a point in our history where um, we have a close division in cultural orientation. 10 years ago, I was very optimistic that we were going to have an emerging new cultural consensus that would enable us to move forward pretty dramatically as a society. A few years ago, I was still optimistic. Now I'm decidedly pessimistic about our future. Um, this matters, I think, to you guys because you're all young. So I was optimistic that we would have huge leaps forward in our society towards the end of my life, and instead, what we're looking at is the possibility that we will have a significant decline in our society as you guys are going through the bulk of your life. So it probably matters more to you in some sense than it does to older folks like myself, what may happen over the next few years. My concern is that we will lose our democracy, such as it is, um, and slide into an authoritarian style of regime. Other countries have had this happen. If you think about the long history of society around the world, democracies are pretty rare. Almost all of the history of all parts of the world have been rooted in authoritarianism in one form or another. So, for a fairly long period of time, Britain has had a more or less a system of that has moved towards being a democratic republic in the modern sense of those terms. And for a couple of hundred years, we've been moving in that direction too. And we're at risk of losing that. So I kind of have an outline we'll go through, but like I said, whenever you guys want to comment or ask questions, by all means, just do so. I guess Jazz needs to like recognize you somehow or
Yeah,
something like
me and Derek will cover that. Don't worry about it.
that. Okay, so um, a lot of times what's said is that the British system has an unwritten constitution, but they have some written documents, the Magna Carta and some other documents that are written that constitute the written core of their constitution. But essentially, it's evolved as a political system over time, and it evolved from a monarchy into a parliamentary system. So their legislative body is the dominant aspect of their political system. They have what's called royal assent in the sense that the monarchs basically agree to whatever Parliament proposes or whatever they pass. They have some rules within Parliament about how many times they have to read stuff. Over time, it was a bicameral body. It was the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the House of Commons originated money bills. But the House of Lords had equal authority in legislative matters for centuries. That changed just a little over 100 years ago, where the House of Lords has become basically perfunctory. They basically play the role that they can delay substantive bills by up to 1 year if it's not involving any money, any expenditures or taxes or whatever. But otherwise, the House of Lords is pretty much irrelevant now. In our system, which originated in the late 1700s, um, we started with a written constitution, in large part based upon what had been observed of the British system up to that point, because most of the people in our system, when they were founding the Constitution, had a lot of familiarity with the English system, because that was the one that the colonies grew out of. They also had some historical knowledge, or uh, s- some historical knowledge of the Roman system. Of course, their scholarly research into Roman history at that time was not as advanced as it became in recent centuries, but they knew something about the Roman Republic and its decay from a republic into monarchy. So they tried to use some aspects of the Roman system, but a lot of what they knew from the British system to develop a written constitution. And we sometimes think of our system as being based on a written constitution, but the truth of the matter is it's overwhelmingly an unwritten constitution in the United States as well. The written constitution is just basically provides the formative structure of our system. It establishes some restrictive requirements. It asserts some duties and obligations within the system on the different parts of the branches of government. And it establishes a certain number of procedural requirements that have to be fulfilled. And some of our rituals that we look towards, like the inauguration or things like that, are rooted in the procedural requirements of the Constitution that was written. But when it was formed, when it was developed, I mean, there was a lot of debate about how to form it, what the structure should be, and what the implications would be. And right there, the fact that they were debating in the Constitutional Convention about what was meant by what they were doing tells us right at the outset, right from the get go, that it was the way of thinking about what they were writing, how to lay out the words, how to interpret the words, how to effectuate the words that was going to be the determining factor in the way in which our political system developed. So it was all of the parts all of the parts of that discussion about what the Constitution would actually mean substantively was the beginning of the unwritten Constitution that we have uh, evolved over the last couple of 100 years. So um, the written constitution is basically just skeletal, but the flesh and the organs of our system are the unwritten constitution, which is far vaster, far more expansive than the written constitution itself. Um, and the written constitution has been changed by amendments over time, but the unwritten constitution has evolved within our socio-cultural system, within our socio-economic system, within our socio-political system. And without that, the written constitution is relatively meaningless. It's kind of vacuous unless you have ways of deciding how to implement or how to interpret the written constitution. And that was something that was fairly unknown at the start. They had the debates during the Constitutional Convention. They had the Federalist Papers that were written to persuade the country, the different states, to adopt the written Constitution and to form a United States. So there was debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists with respect to adopting the Constitution. And that argument basically was the the early formation of the unwritten component of our system, of our constitutional system. Um, and then once it was adopted and the United States began with George Washington as the first president, there was a lot of uncertainty about how it would flow, what would happen, what could actually be doable. And so a lot of it took shape just, from the beginning, but from the beginning of trying to figure out what to do during those early years. Um, some of the aspects of the unwritten constitution that preceded the written form were common law. So common law had existed in Britain for hundreds of years before the United States formed itself as a distinctive nation. Um, Legislatures and governors had already existed in the colonies, and they kind of took their model, the British system, but every colony had its own approach, different responsibilities or obligations for the legislature, different powers for the governor relative to the legislature. And that still continued even after the written federal constitution was established. The states still had their own independence with respect to the way in which they formed their government, but they all used a legislature and a governor. And actually, within our written constitution, the Congress has an obligation. One of its duties is to make sure that all the states are guaranteed a Republican form of government. That's written into the Constitution, actually. But even from the colonial period, the unwritten aspect was being formed through the types of political systems that they already had. Um, and during the Articles of Confederation, there were pluralistic conflicts between the different economic interests over tariffs and taxes and regulations and public debts. And the issuance of public debts and then the repayment of those debts became an issue in the early formation of the nation. And also, there were variable requirements within the states with respect to political participation, who was eligible, who wasn't eligible, usually based upon property, how much property people had. A certain amount of property would be required often for them to be able to vote, but usually a larger amount of property was required for people to hold office. So did not include everybody at the beginning. All of this was preceded basically the written constitution. And so the unwritten constitution precedes the written constitution and with respect to how people already were thinking about the formation of the government and how it should function. Um, then, as it was developed, as it was being adopted, as it was being written and adopted, as I said, there were debates about the wording, the meaning, the interpretation, and the consequences during the convention. And then there was a debate mostly carried out in the newspapers of the time and other publications, pamphlets about adopting or not adopting the Constitution, and that was probably in the early stages one of the most significant ways in which the unwritten component of our constitutional system developed was the proposed interpretation that the Federalists made in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison and Jay writing those papers, suggesting that there were good reasons to adopt the Constitution to end the Articles of Confederation, to form a more United States with a more powerful federal government. Their interpretations of what would happen, their speculation about what would happen, represented their idea of how it would unfold beyond the actual words that were written down as a text, which is really not that many pages. And obviously, a political system is vastly more complex than a small number of pages can be. So we need to recognize from the outset that our Constitution was mostly unwritten and that we just got the form of our system, the form of our constitutional system from the written component. Um, and of course, also in the Constitutional Convention, there had been debate about including a Bill of Rights. But most of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention poo-pooed that as a waste of time. They basically wanted to just lay out the skeletal form of the Constitution, and they assumed that the rights that were ultimately codified in the Bill of Rights would be preserved because they were indicative of the types of rights that were accepted within the British system. So, the Revolutionary era, the actual revolution itself, the formation of opposition to um, colonial government by Britain, and a decision to oppose that with the Revolutionary War, all of that depended upon freedom of expression of political opinion. So even though the British system didn't have a freedom of speech constitutional requirement, there was a history of allowing dissent and disagreement that was characteristic of the Republican system that constituted the British system, the early version of a Republican system. And so in the United States, it was assumed that that was going to continue on too, as well as the other aspects of the Bill of Rights. But concern that we could pretty quickly in our own country devolve into an authoritarian system compelled the advocates for adopting the Constitution to agree that they would quickly write a Bill of Rights and have those amendments adopted within the Constitution as an alteration of the written version, even though there was an expectation already that those Bill of Rights and more rights that were not even specified within the Bill of Rights would be implicitly understood to be a component of the unwritten Constitution. That there is some debate in judicial philosophy as to how tightly we need to cling to what was written and to what extent we can recognize that even at that time, not all of the rights that were expected to be available to people were enumerated within the Bill of Rights. We're not going to really get into that on this podcast, though. Um, then, as the system unfolded, as it started to become instantiated, and people were elected to be in the House of Representatives, senators were selected by the states, and Washington became president, and the new nation began to form. Um, the legislative body, the House and the Senate, they had to adopt rules and procedures. All that's part of the unwritten Constitution. It's not specified in any detail in the Constitution itself. What they chose to do, what they felt was appropriate as a way to proceed to do the business that they were obligated to do under the Constitution itself, the written version. Um, they had to formulate a pattern, a plan for that. There was within the consensus of the individuals who comprised those legislative bodies. And so from that point forward, we've had a history of legislative processes in which there were norms that applied to the procedures and the rules that would actually be used to achieve substantive outcomes. We're at a point now in our history where many of those norms, as they have evolved over the last couple of hundred years, have broken down to the point where it's not really feasible for Congress as a legislative as a dual legislative body, as a bicameral legislative body, to actually perform its functions under and to do its constitutional duty, as specified by the written Constitution itself, because of the way in which the unwritten Constitution has evolved to basically produce obstructionist tactics as effective tactics. So that the House can still function well enough, even though many of the norms have broken down and it has lost some of the functional capability that it had decades ago. The Senate has become basically dysfunctional. It's almost impossible to pass anything of real substantive significance other than bills that involve money because of the filibuster rule that we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast. And I know you guys covered some of that in your first podcast.
One thing
Uh,
I just want to note that I think is kind of interesting when talking about the Constitution and like the development of America is how similar, like everything you're saying, if I just removed the Constitution and put in like any religion, it would sound completely coherent. I just think it's kind of neat to look at how similar a religious belief system, the parallels between like a religious belief system and a an economic belief system, or an economic or a political belief system. And that's all I wanted to say. I just think it's very interesting listening to like you talk about like some people obviously like read the Constitution more strictly, which could also be applied to like Catholics and Baptists, or like the different sects of each religion. I think it's just kind of neat.
yeah, I think that is an interesting comment. Um, yeah, so um, as the, as the nation kind of as the new nation kind of unfolded, there were questions about how independent the cabinet would be from the president, how much authority they would have, the cabinet members would have on their own. The Sedition Act was some of the early legislation was passed to try to squelch criticism of President Adams and the Federalists. And um, we already had the Bill of Rights, we already had the First Amendment freedoms, but just exactly what did that mean? And what was permissible with respect to clamping down on freedom of political expression? Because the First Amendment was really not about your right to right to tell your friend go fuck themselves if you're irritated with them or something like that. It was intended uh, to protect political speech, political expression primarily, so that there would be the capacity of people to dissent within the system, to criticize the system, and right away, there was a question of whether or not the Bill of Rights was meaningful in that respect, or the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights was meaningful in that respect. Were the Sedition Acts going to be a common feature of our political system in which people could be actually prosecuted and imprisoned for their dissent, for their criticism of the government? That actually happened very early on in history, where people among the Jeffersonian Party, the Democratic Republican Party, were prosecuted and imprisoned for criticism of the government very early in our history. So, a lot was uncertain right from the beginning, and gradually things became somewhat more cemented. Um, some other examples of the way in which the unwritten Constitution developed had to do with the important case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, in which Chief Justice Marshall proclaimed the right of the Supreme Court to engage in judicial review. It was something discussed, not settled upon in the Constitutional Convention. Discussed and not settled upon in debates, in decisions about to adopt the Constitution. But very early in our history, he asserted the right of the judiciary to nullify federal legislation or other acts of the government that were contradictory to the Constitution, the written Constitution itself, or their interpretation of it. So from that point forward, the Supreme Court has had the right of judicial review. That doesn't exist in Britain, so it was a novel concept in our system of government. Um, it still doesn't exist in Britain. The House of Lords has something kind of like that. I'm not an expert on British parliamentary law, but within our system, it was a novel concept that he asserted right away. That maybe has been undercut by the way in which the court dealt with the SB 8 vigilante abortion bill in Texas. It's not clear to me that they can assert or that they can make the decision that they made and still proclaim that they have that fundamental right of judicial review. That's a more complicated topic. We might deal with that in another podcast at some point. Um, uh, Later in our history, during the Civil War, there was a conflict between Chief Justice Taney and Abraham Lincoln over the suspension of habeas corpus. Um, did the Supreme Court have authority over the president in a time of war in which he felt like the preservation of the Union was more vital than adhering to a Supreme Court decision? Under that very concept of judicial review that had been asserted in Marbury versus Madison, whether or not um, the president could be forced um, to basically knuckle under and do what the Supreme Court told him at the time. And then, very importantly, in the last century and all the way up to now, are the various interpretations of the 14th Amendment that have unfolded. It took a while before the 14th Amendment contributed very significantly to the forward movement of our political system
Do you want to
toward
quickly
a.
cover what the 14th Amendment is? Sorry.
Okay, so basically, it the 14th and the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments were the result of the Civil War. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment um, it has two clauses in it that are used a lot in constitutional interpretation to expand the rights of people. In the 1800s, in the late 1800s, um, the due process clause was first applied to corporations as individuals. So the idea that a corporation constitutes a single human being for constitutional purposes, and that all the rights within the Bill of Rights that any single individual citizen has within our system of government also applies to a corporation as if it were an individual person, was a decision that grew out of the 14th Amendment's due process clause with respect to life, liberty, and property in the late 1800s, not that many years after the 14th Amendment had been passed. But finally, in the 20th century, um, with a variety of cases, mostly dealing with oppression of blacks within the South, um, the equal protection of laws clause within the 14th Amendment became more heavily used. Most significantly in the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954, when the Supreme Court unanimously decided to overrule Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 division, um, legalizing and sanctifying segregation Um, that decision was overruled unanimously in 1954 by Brown versus Board of Education, and they used the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to justify the overruling of that decision. The 14th Amendment was already in place before Plessy versus Ferguson was decided in the late 1800s, the very late 1800s. But, it was not applied in that way. It wasn't interpreted in that way by that court. But, almost 60 years later, it was interpreted more broadly by the Warren Court. Um, and so from that point forward, the Equal Protection Clause has been important to civil rights cases. But the expansion of our other rights that cultural conservatives generally are dissatisfied with also comes from the 14th Amendment. It's the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment that is used for those cases. So cases which illegalized or struck down as unconstitutional prohibition of interracial marriage, um, the right to use contraceptives, ultimately Roe versus Wade. All of these are rights that were granted to people not because they existed within the Bill of Rights, but because the Due Process Clause, with respect to life, liberty, and property, was expanded to include these kinds of concepts. These rights were granted to people based upon the idea that essentially life, liberty, and property um, was a broader concept than what was instantiated in written form within the Bill of Rights when the Bill of Rights was enumerated. In other words, when I talked about a little while ago, there was a lot of understanding about what was assumed to be true within the society as far as the rights that people had. And there wasn't any belief that they could effectively think of every possibility and enumerate all possibilities adequately in the Bill of Rights when it was written. And because there was a long history in common law of rights that were attached to life, liberty, and property, going back to the kind of contract theory of John Locke, which was very instrumental in the philosophical perspective of the constitutional framers. Is there a problem?
I'll make you louder. You can keep talking.
Okay. So, in the constitutional framers, they had relied heavily on the theory of John Locke. Oh, okay. So I need to change my volume. All right. Wish we had done that sooner. Can you guys hear me okay?
Jazz is helping his dad fix his microphone.
Yeah, turned up the volume on the mic. Were you able to hear everything I said up to that point okay?
Yeah, yeah. It's
Okay,
fine. It's fine through Discord, but I believe it's not as good on Twitch.
okay. So, where was I at? Oh, so life, liberty, and property had been like I mean, it was in the Declaration of Independence, although they didn't say property, they said pursuit of happiness. But within Lockean theory, it was property. So there was a longer history going back more than 100 years before the Constitution was written in thinking, in philosophical uh, debate and jurisprudence with respect to these principles and the implementation of rules about the due process aspect of that within common law in Britain and within the colonies before the Constitution itself was framed. So, from the standpoint of the Warren Court, when they expanded the rights of people with respect to the right of privacy, which is what most of these cases are about, um, they just assumed that, of course, historically there had always been an assumption of right of privacy. It was so implicit in our assumption within our societal activity that it was not even something that they had imagined that they would even need to enumerate in the Bill of Rights. It was just such an obvious thing at the time in which people were living when the Constitution was framed, when the Bill of Rights was enumerated, that that's not something that was ever doubted. Now, what that means substantively is always subject to debate. But that's the point is that the system has evolved. And as it evolved, then interpretations of what really falls under the scope of public or private has evolved with it. And so, starting basically in the 1960s, more or less, you started to have an expansion of the right of privacy, which has led all the way up to um, the constitutional decision that states had to permit gays to be married. Um, all of that, all of that basically comes out of what they refer to as the penumbra of rights that were around the rights that were enumerated in the Bill of Rights, but were implicitly understood by the people of the time in which the Constitution was framed, based upon a philosophy and a jurisprudence that had preceded the framing of the Constitution itself, the written document. So, like I said, the unwritten part of our Constitution is vast by comparison to the written portion, um, and it's subject to evolution, and always has been from the very beginning. It was not clear what it all meant right at the start, and it kind of had to play out. It had to play out within the institutions that were identified within the Constitution, but had to themselves figure out ways to proceed and evolve as institutional forms. And the extent to which they could become interdependent, interreliant, and eventually check one another. So, in our system of checks and balances, judicial review is one of the checks on the other components of the system. It was not written in the Constitution, it was asserted in a Supreme Court decision. It's now a part of our unwritten Constitution. Written in the sense that there's a Supreme Court decision that documents it, but it's not a part of our original framing of our Constitution. So if you think of our system as a democratic republic, um, in the modern way in which we would interpret those terms, small d democratic, small r republic, um, we weren't a democratic republic at the outset by any means, not in the way in which we think of them now. I think basically when we think of a democratic system now, we think of a system in which all citizens have the opportunity for effective political participation. And we think of a republic as a system in which all of the interests of society can be equitably represented. Doesn't mean that every individual gets a vote on every individual policy that has to be decided. It's not a pure republic like the Athenian Republic of ancient Greece, but it's for a political system now to be a meaningful republic, to be a full republic. I think you have to have a system in which it's fair to say that all of the interests of society are equitably represented. And democracy basically means that everybody has the opportunity to participate as a voter or as an office holder. So a democratic republic kind of merges those two things together. In our earliest constitutional formation, as it was devised and imagined, as written and unwritten by the founders of our constitutional system, um, democratic had no place. If anything, if we wanted to write it out the way I did in my little outline here, is that I put democratic in a tiny, tiny little font, a small font, because it was barely democratic. That was not the objective. The objective was to form a republic. By our current standards, it wasn't really a republic either. So I kind of would write that with different kinds of fonts of different sizes with the words kind of stretched out and spread out because you could recognize, in some sense, the core of a republic there, but it wasn't in the sense that we would think of a republic now. Um, all interests were not equitably represented, not even close. So it was the beginnings of a republic. Now, put it in historical context to be fair, it was as republic as you could get at that time in history. So Britain had already evolved towards a republic, and that informed our constitutional framers as to what they wanted to do within our system of government. They basically liked the British system; they just wanted their own autonomy. Um, but they liked the way the government was organized for the most part. So they formed a republic similar to the British system. There were probably republics. I would have to go back and look more closely at history in the Netherlands at that time, maybe elsewhere in some of the Germanic small states, maybe Switzerland. I'm not sure, um, but I think the Netherlands probably had a republic as effective as ours, but it was a very small country with a relatively small variety of economic interests and a small diversity of economic activity. relative to Britain and to the United States in its early days. So we had a much bigger variety of different kinds of economic activity, manufacturing, brewing, agricultural, different kinds of agriculture. So we had uh, a more varied, more diverse economy, and so did Britain. So for large geographic nations, those were the only two republics in place at the time. So by the standards of the times, it was fair to call it a republic. But by our standards now, we could barely even recognize it as such when it formed. You'll hear um, you'll hear both Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives refer to the Ben Franklin remark. Sometimes said that it happened after he left the Constitutional Convention. It actually happened as he was, being hosted at a party by a woman who was a socialite in Philadelphia at the time. But she asked him, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of government shall we have? A monarchy or a republic?" And his response was, "A republic, if you can keep it." And you hear Democrats and Republicans both refer to that, both trying to say, we're at risk of losing our republic now, and refer to the Ben Franklin speech. I think it would have been impossible for him to have imagined it or to have speculated about the future of our system well enough. But if he could have, it would have been more apt if what he had said was, "You have the potential of a republic if you can make a start toward it." And that's basically what they were trying to do. Was they were trying to put together a system that had some coherence to it, a system that could stick for a while. Because the Articles of Confederation, although they probably could have succeeded and they probably could have evolved towards a workable system, they weren't considered to be efficient enough without a federal government. So the objective was to figure out how to unite the states into one federal government, leaving them with a lot of independence as states, and construct a system that would be able to stick together for a period of time. And that was a challenge. So, from our standpoint, here are some of the problems with why we wouldn't say that it was a democratic system when it formed. Um, there were property requirements, as I mentioned, for voting and for holding office. That was part of the unwritten Constitution early on, and that was still in place when the Constitution itself was adopted. So, in most states, not everybody could vote. Setting aside the fact that slaves in the South were not even citizens, free freedmen, blacks in the North, could also not vote, but people who didn't meet certain threshold of property requirements also couldn't vote. And like I said, usually a higher standard of property requirement for participation as office holders. So only a very small proportion of the populace at that time actually did participate as voters, either because they weren't eligible or because they knew that their interests could not be represented. As somebody working for um, a cobbler, they probably knew as an apprentice that they probably had no relevance, that their interests as an apprentice cobbler were not going to be heard within the halls of whatever legislative body at the state level or at the federal level. So they had no interest in voting because they had no way of being represented. Um, and ultimately, the biggest factor that's still a factor for people is just the convenience of voting or the cost of voting, that the opportunity cost, in a sense, the time it takes to go and make the effort to vote. So the people who were most likely to vote were the ones who were most vested in the system. They had the biggest stake in the system. Um, and even a smaller proportion of people who could hold office then could vote effectively. Or and a factor there was, even though at the federal level, all of the office holders were paid a salary, and that was part of the written constitution, is that they would be paid a salary, which was a step forward in a sense because traditionally office holders had not been paid, which meant that only people who were independently wealthy could really hold office that consumed a substantial amount of their time. And in most states, that still tended to be the case. At the federal level, salaries were a part of the system, but as a practical matter, it was usually people who were pretty wealthy who were able to take the time, and independently wealthy in the sense that they didn't have to be at their business all the time, who could serve in office holding roles. Um, so not very democratic, but with respect to republic, it had a little bit of a republic aspect to it, just as the British tradition had developed. Um, the the way in which we stitched it together, the way in which the founders stitched the Constitution together was to try to figure out how they could have a system in which the various moneyed interests, the economic elites, could have their vested interests pursued effectively, or at least they could have their say in matters with respect to policymaking, with respect to tariffs and taxes and regulations and the like, or the construction of roads, or ultimately canals and the railroad, etc. But even at that time, just the promotion of commerce, which was in the preamble of the Constitution, was one of the objectives, and it's also in other parts of the Constitution too, that commerce is to be promoted by the federal government. And so the idea of making it easier for commerce to occur was a primary objective. And that tells you right away that one of the accomplishments that they were pursuing was to make sure that the economic elites had success in the new system. It was ultimately the economic elites that were going to adopt the Constitution. It wasn't open for a public referendum of all the people in the society. It was adopted state by state in the legislatures, which were themselves not very democratic. And so it was always really a matter of getting the vested interest, the economic elites of the society, to sign on to agree that this was a system that would work well enough for them that they were willing to make this transition from the Articles of Confederation towards a federal system. Um, and so, yeah, the objective was just to create a a workable, sustainable system. They wanted something that would last for a while, longer than the Articles of Confederation had lasted. They were hoping that it would last for decades and flesh itself out over time in the way that it ultimately did. But it was a big challenge. It was a big challenge to get that to work out. The compromises of the Constitution, the three-fifths rule with respect to the counting of people in the census for allocation of seats in the House of Representatives was one of those compromises. In general, in order to keep the union as a whole, to get all the states to participate in it effectively, they really had to cater to the southern states. And already by that time, the southern states had already developed an economic system oriented around slavery, and an agricultural aristocracy had already arisen and dominated the politics within those states. But they still needed somehow to convince those states with their agrarian aristocracy to be full participants within the federal system. And that was right from the beginning the hardest part. It was always the biggest threat to our system. It's still ultimately the problem that we face now, the crisis that we face or will be facing in the next few years, trying to preserve our democratic republican system, is if I had to say what is the one word that describes why we are where we are, we're about to slide out of democracy into authoritarianism, that single word would be slavery. It was the challenge. It was a challenge of accommodating slavery in the southern states when it was not widespread in the north by that time already, and giving the southern agrarian aristocrats disproportionate, overwhelmingly disproportionate power within the system. The compromises that enabled them to have that um, were necessary in order to get the system to stick together at the beginning. But it never stopped being a challenge after that. It never stopped being a challenge when the moral standards of people in the North, under the motivation of their religious convictions, caused large numbers of people to become abolitionists. And ultimately, the threat of the pursuit of abolition of slavery provoked the South to secede, and we fought a civil war over that. We ended up with the abolition of slavery, but after a period of relatively ineffectual reconstruction, oppression and apartheid became the dominant structure of our social system within the South from that point on until middle of the last century. And the socio-political dynamics, the socio-political transformations that have occurred over the last 75 years that have brought us to the cusp of disaster as a society are the consequence of those are the consequence of our attempts to overcome our slave history that Reconstruction failed to successfully do. So ultimately, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision that I mentioned earlier, the legislation that Congress passed in the 60s, the civil rights legislation, the voting rights legislation. There were other legislative civil rights legislation that passed earlier than that in 1948 under the Truman administration. There were civil rights movement that preceded Martin Luther King and the NAACP and SNCC and all of those organizational components of the civil rights movement that blossomed in the 1950s and 1960s, saw legislative success along with constitutional success by the Supreme Court's actions. All of that precipitated changes within our socio-political system that have brought us to the cusp of tragedy. So it's kind of an ironic tragedy that we made forward progress as a society and brought ourselves to the point of losing what we had achieved as a democratic republic. And the irony of this is sad and disturbing. It's a little bit emotional for me. I have to make sure I check my emotions on this point. um,
Guys, go get your dad some water.
no, I got some water here. So, what I want to emphasize, though, so I spent more time on that than I really expected to. I just kind of, things occur to me, and I just say them. So, what I want to emphasize, though, some of those points we'll come back to a little bit later. But what I want to emphasize now is the way in which it stuck together and the way in which it evolved. So, how did that unwritten constitutional system evolve? How did it stick together? How did they keep the South in? How did they keep the merchants in from the North? The shippers that would ship out furniture to England or import furniture from England. How did they, the rum manufacturers, et cetera? How did they keep that system of very diverse economic objectives, the economic elites pursuing very diverse economic objectives, how did they keep them together into a coherent system? Um, and I think that comes down to something that Madison tried to speculate about in Federalist Paper number 10, which has to do with the factionalism of the economic elites, remembering that they weren't trying to form a democratic system. And he has uh, critical remarks to make of democracy. Although in that um, in that paper, he's really referring to the kind of full democratic system that could exist in a very small community, relatively speaking. But trying to do that on a large scale wasn't something that was imagined as desirable or feasible. But nevertheless, he did talk about the idea that there would be factions that would be basically oriented around the economic elites, um, and their conflict with each other, their competition with respect to one another. Tariffs for a particular set of imports or exports would be maybe advantageous for one group of economic elites, but disadvantageous for another. The same thing with respect to the provision of armaments for the putting down of potential rebellions in certain areas of the country, so that it would be easier for a militia to be called up or a federal force to be called up and put down a potential rebellion. Where were those armaments going to be located? How are we going to deal with runaway slaves when they manage to get into the North, where they could be treated as freed individuals? Um, so there were a variety of economic elite interests that were going to be competing with one another, and without referring to any of them with any specificity, Madison argued that basically um, they could compete with each other politically within the institutions of the new republic. So they could compete legislatively. They can compete for control of the executive branch. And the challenge would be to build a majority coalition. So if they can manage to put together a majority coalition of multiple factions uh, to implement policies that were favorable to that coalition, they would have to be within the coalition compromising with each other, faction to faction, making compromises with one another against each other's interests a little bit and in favor of each other's interests a little bit. Nobody getting everything that they wanted, and always that would be vulnerable to breakup in the sense that another faction or other factions could bargain with members of that coalition and offer them a better deal and reshift the majority coalition to a different group of elite interests. That's basically the idea, was that if the economic elites would accept the idea that majority rules within the institutions themselves, within the legislative body, and that the federal had some supremacy in certain respects to the states and could keep the states' desire to like impose tariffs upon one another across state boundaries, prohibiting that, keeping other state-oriented economic interventions under control, but competing with one another to form coalitions where majority rule within the legislative body would enable policies to be enacted that they could imagine that even when they lost in a particular conflict, that they had the potential to win later. So if they could lose now, but still aspire to win later by reshifting the majority coalition, by reshifting the factional cooperation and the bargaining between the factions to achieve a different majority outcome, then they could still have a reason to stay attached to the system. They could have an expectation that if they were willing to compromise themselves and give up a little for what another faction desired, that they might gain more than what they had gained when they had been in the minority and had lost in the previous policy debate. So the idea, this is the pluralism of the United States that was critical to its fundamental evolution. That was critical to the way in which the unwritten Constitution evolved over hundreds of years. Um, because that was what enabled it to sustain itself for a period of time, was that the economic elites recognized that whenever they lost, they could win later. And so they would accept not just the outcomes of majority rule within legislative bodies, within the House and the Senate, but they would accept majority rule within the electorate. So the ability of the electorate, small as it was, to determine by majority rule who the political elites themselves would be, who would be the representatives in the House, who would be the senators, who would be the president. Um, and a lot of negotiations in those times were expected to take place with respect to uh, electing a president and forming a cabinet, kind of like you would have in the parliamentary system, where the cabinet has a certain amount of autonomy from the prime minister. So within that system, there was an expectation that if they would accept the idea that majority of the electorate could choose the political elites, and that majority coalitions, factions amongst the political elites could produce the policies that the society would abide by, that was a system that would work well for them. One of the key aspects of this that made it potentially viable for them was that in whatever majority coalition would form at any given time, there was a recognition that there would be certain aspects of that that were going to be stable. So there would be certain aspects that would be basically accepted and perhaps required by any majority coalition that could effectively form. And so that meant there would be a core of stable policies around which the system could develop. So stability is something that people can use as a basis for their own strategic decision making. So once they know that there are going to be stable core policies, then the peripheral policies may be subject to instability and may be open to manipulation and competition. But the core policies that were, of course, not surprisingly, very beneficial to the elites across the board would be stable. And so this was the buy-in that people were willing to make, that basically were the power brokers in the society of the time. The economic elites and the political elites were willing to accept majority rule within the legislature, majority rule within the electorate, in order to preserve a system in which they could have meaningful, contestable elections. And it's meaningful, contestable elections, really, that were the chief mechanism by which our unwritten constitution, our political system as a whole, has evolved over the last couple hundred years. Without those meaningful, contestable elections that were accepted early on by the elites, we wouldn't have the system that we have. We wouldn't have moved towards a democratic republic from a very small font democratic, really skewed looking republic towards something that has a pretty big font for democratic and a pretty easily recognizable republic. Um, we've come close to having, not extremely close, other societies have done better than we have, but we've come reasonably close to having substantively a democratic republic. And as I said, a number of societies have done better than us. They surpassed us. Again, the cultural challenges that we faced because of slavery have been the primary impediment to our ability to get all the way to a democratic republic, and that's what's put us on the verge now of losing our system of government. Um, so meaningful contestable elections were the core. That was the core from the beginning. That's what enabled the whole thing to stick together long enough for an unwritten constitution to develop, to put the flesh and organs on the skeletal system of the written constitution itself. Enabled us to have a political system that could evolve, adapt, be resilient. As the economy changed, as the socioeconomic system changed, as the sociocultural system changed, the sociopolitical system could change accordingly. Not always in lockstep, not always effectively, but it was capable of adaptation and resilience because of meaningful contestable elections. Um, so just naturally though, once that process got started and we started to have those elections and we started to have majority coalitions and legislatures implementing policies and people accepted that, they accepted the fact that they were going to lose. Everybody had to accept the fact that sometimes they were going to lose, but they were going to stay loyal to the system because of their belief that in the long run, they could get their way again at some other point in time. So acceptance of defeat was critical, but it was a consensus among political elites that that was a workable system because they knew that their most critical interests were going to be a part of the stable core of the policies that would be protected by the system it has evolved. And so they knew that their own their the most vital interests would be in good shape. Um, so, nevertheless, as the economy grew, there was some incremental democratization naturally, just because it became easier for people to attain the property thresholds for participating in the system, for voting, and for holding office. So, as that happened, you had movement towards a larger font, democratic. You had movement towards a more democratic republic. And also, over time, coalitions that or factions that found themselves in the losing coalitions over and over again and could not figure out a way to manipulate the system to their advantage, or for that matter, factions that were in a winning coalition but felt like they had a narrow margin of victory that couldn't be considered to be stable with respect to the peripheral policies that they were pursuing, would sometimes recognize the advantages of expanding the electorate. So sometimes the coalitional majority at any given time would desire to expand the electorate because that might strengthen their factional positioning within the factional struggle for majority coalitions. And to achieve majorities within the electorate would enhance their strength in the pursuit of their policies. So you had incremental improvement towards a greater level of democracy within the democratic system, but it was acceptance of majority rule within the legislature and acceptance of majority outcomes in the elections that enabled that progress to be made. Um, so you can think about the evolution of our system. I mean, you all taken history, so you all know about Jacksonian democracy, the nullification theory, and the assertion of states' rights, the Civil War itself to settle that matter, the effort to reconstruct the Union and readmit the Southern states into the Union, the use or the I'm sorry, the rise of modern corporations within the late 1800s, the way in which they elaborated their organizational structure and started to resemble in a nascent form something like what we have in our modern society now, our modern economy now. The struggle of workers through the industrial revolution to achieve some redress of their grievances. Um, One of the biggest challenges, one of the most fundamental evolutionary processes that we experienced was how that could be attained against the interests of the economic elites. Um, Second to slavery, that's probably the most important factor in deciding how our sociopolitical system transformed itself as dramatically as it did towards a democratic republic. Um, and black disenfranchisement, uh, the after that is after the passage of the 15th Amendment giving blacks the right to vote. Um, there were still very successful efforts to disenfranchise the blacks throughout the South. The Jim Crow laws, the apartheid in effect, the segregation. Um, Something's beeping. I don't know if it's related to this or if it's my phone here.
Keenan is asking a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is Jazz not letting somebody ask a question?
What?
He has posted a video. It's a 40-second clip of Paul Weyrich, who's the founder of the New Right, supposedly.
I was gonna
Yeah.
probably wait until after my dad's done to let him view that. That's not, I don't think,
I
particularly.
know who he is. I know who he is, and I know what that's about. They were uh, that they were attempting to shrink the size of the federal government through limitations on taxation or reductions in taxation. Is that correct? Is
Oh,
that clip
here, I'll
related to
let
that?
Keenan come speak.
The Keenan talk. Yeah, I don't mind interruptions or questions. I didn't expect to just be talking by myself.
Keenan, you have to accept that. There we go.
Oh, hello.
Hey there.
Hi. So not exactly. That video is about how Paul Weyrich, he was talking about how uh reducing okay, here the quote says, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the vote populace goes down.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm familiar with that one too. Yeah. So there are people in our society, and we'll have to address this if we're going to deal with the possibility of an authoritarian slide. We have to address the idea that there are people who want fewer people to participate in the electorate. At this point, is something I had at the end of my outline, but at this point in our history, it's more about biasing the electorate than circumscribing the right to vote. So it's difficult, given the way in which our unwritten constitutional history has developed. It's very difficult to um, illegalize voting or to, by statute, prevent people from voting that have already gained the right to vote, whether that's blacks, women, 18-year-olds, etc. Um, but what they're trying to do institutionally is to bias the electorate either by codifying rules that make it less likely that people will successfully be able to participate as voters, either by the way in which they have to, um, by the rules of like IDs or various other mechanisms, but even more importantly, perhaps, is the way in which they try to make it make the cost and inconvenience of voting very great again. So by how many locations they have for voting, how crowded those locations are going to be, how long the lines are going to be, that's been a tried and true method for biasing the electorate in a way that would produce outcomes that didn't actually reflect the majority opinion. Yes, and Wayrich and others, um, they're pretty open about that. That goes back a ways. Do you know when that clip was from? I think it was from a long time ago.
It says on the clip, I think it says from the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. So that's been a part of the strategy. I don't want to ascribe that as a strategy of the Republican Party specifically, because obviously when we get into the socio-political dynamics, which will not be in this podcast, but another podcast, we'll get into it in more detail. Um, the Democratic Party in the South was a one-party rule system for many decades, and they completely disenfranchised black voters in most southern states. So you cannot ascribe that characteristic to the Republican Party. It just so happens that when he was saying that, the Republican Party was pursuing what's called the Southern strategy, and they were trying to realign partisan attachments within the South to move from. They wanted voters, white voters in particular, to go from being Democratic voters to being Republican voters. Um, and so the Republican Party, it was too late for them to disenfranchise blacks at that point. but they knew that it was not in their best interest for the entire electorate to vote. Um, and in New Jersey and other states, it had been part of the machine party apparatus to try to um, control who effectively voted. If it was a machine that was relying upon the workers and they had their local their block leaders or whatever who would get out to vote, who had money to go, who were paid to go around and make sure everybody got to the polls and voted for the machine, um, they would be trying to increase the size of the electorate. If they were on the other side, which was usually certain types of economic elites within the city or whatever, they would want to reduce the effectiveness. They would want to curtail the voting hours. They would want to make sure that they voted. I mean, you could vote in local elections on Saturdays just as easily on Tuesdays, and so, but they would want to vote on working days so that the size of the electorate would be smaller, so that they would have disproportionate effect from the middle class voters or the upper income voters. So, I mean, that was always a part of the strategy in and around the gradually evolving democratic republic that we've come to approach, and it was always, in a sense, part of the game. And in some sense, it was, you know, not always fair game because the courts had their say in this matter. Um, in New Jersey, they applied specific sanctions against the Republican Party, in other states as well, for their effort to bias the electorate. One of the techniques that they would use would put flyers around on people's doors in black communities, telling them that the actual voting day was a different day from the actual voting day. So they would tell people to vote on, Wednesday, November 4th, if the actual voting day was Tuesday, November 3rd, in order to try to bias the electorate favorably for themselves. And they suffered some penalties from the judiciary as a result of those kinds of tactics. So Democrats, Republicans, for different strategic purposes in different parts of the country, engage in those kinds of tactics to get the electorate that they wanted. Again, the objective was not on the part of those people to achieve a democratic republic. They were trying to stymie the advancement of our society towards a democratic republic. But it was part of the game, and both political parties pursued it. Obviously, it was pursued more diligently from an ideological perspective on the part of conservatives than on the part of liberals. Um, in my own thinking, I was influenced by a book by a guy, I think his name was E. E. Schachtschneider, when I was a beginning graduate student in political science. He had written a book, I think it was called The Sovereign State or something. I wasn't prepared to talk about this, so I hadn't Googled it. Might have gotten the name wrong. But in that book, he talked about how much progress could be made from a policy standpoint in favor of the interests of the working class if we could just get all of the working class to vote. And the idea was that if you could just expand the electorate, you could make substantial economic progress in society. You could make substantial progress towards equity in society for all of its participants. But you had to have effective, active political participation of all of the interests of society. And that meant dramatically expanding an electorate, which at that time, um, only about half of the people voted. Is still about that in most elections, and local elections, much less than that. So the objective was, if you could get a larger proportion of the electorate to vote, make it easier for them to vote, uh, then you could get substantial progress. Well, we actually have had substantial progress in that respect. For most of our history, voting was just on one day over a certain number of hours, mostly during the hours that people were at work. And so, unless a particular state or a particular city made it a working holiday, sometimes unions would put it in their contracts that that would be a paid day off for union members to be able to go vote on election day. So, unless you had stipulations that would enable working class voters to vote effectively, if you could get the hours extended to 7 p.m., then maybe when they got off work, they might have a chance to go vote. But guess what? At that point, the lines would be extremely long because guess who was voting at that time? All the people who had been on the job from 8 to 5. So the lines would be very long, making it very inconvenient. So there was always a challenge to move us in the direction of making voting easier for people. We've made a lot of progress in that respect. It is a strategy right now to curtail a lot of that progress, But yeah, like in Texas, we have early voting that extends for, I guess, 10 days or something like that prior to the election. Um, People have now learned that they can vote by mail. Absentee balloting has been around since I think the Civil War, but people can now recognize that that's a convenient way to vote. In California, most people vote that way and have voted that way for a significant amount of time now. Voting by mail is also taking place in Colorado and Oregon. You get much higher electoral participation by the electorate when you allow them to vote by mail in that way, where it's convenient, where the ballots are mailed out to the people and it's easy for them to actually undertake the task of voting. But even having early voting and extending hours, having judges sometimes rule that the polls have to stay open when the lines are long, um, all of those things that make voting a little bit more feasible for people potentially expand the electorate. And Waywich was absolutely adamantly opposed to each of those innovations in favor of making our society more closely resemble a full and complete democratic republic. Thank you for that contribution. If you have anything else you want to say, go ahead.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Let's see, where was I at? So, okay, so, we talked about the historical eras that we've experienced and the kinds of things, all of those things that we talked about, all the things that I just mentioned, a little while ago, as far as like the efforts of the laboring class, the Civil War, Reconstruction, apartheid in the South, et cetera. All of those were part of the evolution of our unwritten constitution. They all contributed to the socio-political transformations of our system. Um, Socioeconomic transformations, sociocultural transformations would produce sociopolitical transformations, but it works the other way around too. So sociopolitical dynamics, sociopolitical transformations would spur sometimes uh, transformations within the socioeconomic system or the sociocultural system, and sometimes they would stymie those transformations and slow down the rate of change. And the sociopolitical system was used for both of those purposes, um, effectively and strategically for all of our history. But it is over that long span of history that through meaningful contestable elections, we've had the system evolve in the way that it has because of the competition between different interest groups in society, originally just economic elites. As we expanded the democratic component of our system, as the system became more effectively a republic, you have a bigger variety of interests that are being effectively represented within the institutional systems themselves. I'm going to take a sip of water. But it's also relevant to know that aside from the kinds of necessary changes that would occur in the legislative bodies, as the socio-political changes would occur, that we also had significant evolution in our unwritten constitution within the executive branch. In the 20th century, it dramatically expanded, in large part because of the growth and the complexity of socioeconomic processes within our society. Also because of America's participation in two world wars and a Vietnam War and a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The military component of our system exploded in terms of the financial output, in terms of the military industrial complex, the industries that rely upon the defense budget as a means of providing profit to the companies and work to the engineers and the laborers who produce the weapon systems, etc. Um, Also, the socio-political transformations uh, that occurred in the 20th century moved us towards democratic republican system of government. They they spurred sociocultural transformations, and as I mentioned earlier, kind of out of the context of the times, that's really the tragic irony that we face is that those sociocultural transformations that resulted from some of the sociopolitical dynamics resulted then in a type of uh, innovation of new strategies within the socio-political system itself that have brought us to the cusp of the disaster that we face now. Um, and that expanded the executive branch. The socio-cultural transformations that we were trying to achieve through the political system expanded the executive branch also. So the bureaucracy grew as we attempted to implement more policies that would more effectively represent and facilitate the success of a larger variety of interests, a larger variety of people within our society. So the executive branch evolved, just like the legislative branch evolved, just like the electoral processes evolved. Um, One of the other Ben Franklin quotes that didn't get used much in the last year or two, like the one about maintaining a republic, was during the Constitutional Convention itself. More or less, probably offhanded remarks, but copied down by Madison, who took thorough notes of the debates and discussions. Ben Franklin said, in reference to George Washington, who at that time was assumed would be unanimously chosen as the first president. He said, the first man, referring to the presidency, he said, the first man put at the helm will be a good one. Nobody knows what sort may come afterwards. The executive will always be increasing here as elsewhere till it ends in a monarchy. That was a rather pessimistic idea that Franklin had. He believed that was the basis for what he said later after the convention was completed, and he told that woman, um, "It's a republic if you can keep it," because the idea was that he didn't expect us to keep it, not permanently. They were trying to put together something that would stick, and they probably would be surprised by how long it did stick, by how the mechanism of meaningful contestable elections enabled the system to have a source of evolutionary advancement um, that enabled the system to be adaptive and resilient through massive cultural changes, through massive economic changes. The system as a whole was able to cling together, to stick together. And the interwebbing of the institutional interdependencies, the interwebbing of the norms that facilitated the institutional effectiveness, all of that grew more and more robust over our extensive history. Um, and I don't think that they really knew that that was going to happen. I don't think that they were that optimistic that it was going to happen. Ben Franklin seemed not to be that optimistic. His remarks were ironic in a sense, because in the British system, it had gone the other direction. It had gone from a monarchy to a republic by the time in which a, a republic in the sense in which they thought of it at the time, not like we think of it now, but it continued to develop and flourish until it became a democratic republic sooner than we did. It's closer to being an idealized democratic republic than our system is. Um, and it had moved from monarchy to republic. So I'm not sure exactly why he said what he did, that as elsewhere, it will end in a monarchy. I think probably in his mind, maybe they'd been talking about the Roman Senate at that time, and he knew that in that system, they had gone from a legislative body to dictators that essentially amounted to a monarchy where the sons would succeed the fathers in the later stages of the Roman Empire. So in his mind, he thought that that was what would happen in our system eventually, that we would eventually deteriorate into a monarchic system, an authoritarian system. So the fear was there right at the founding, right at the writing of our Constitution, right at the founding of our new system. The fear was there that the type of republic that they were going to stitch together amongst the elites, that it would deteriorate inevitably into an authoritarian system, a monarchy. They might have been surprised that it would take until 2022 or 2025, I think is the date that we have to look towards. I think they would be surprised that it would take that long, but they anticipated that we would get to where we are eventually. um, it's also ironic, I guess, how relevant his remarks would be for this time. Nobody knows what sort may come afterwards. And I would just say, I don't know if any of you are
Joe Biden.
supporters of I don't know if any of you are supporters of Donald Trump, but
No, Anthony left actually.
he
So
didn't like
I
the
think
things I
he
was
just
saying.
probably he left a while ago. But anyway, so yeah, there's no Trump supporters now.
So in my view, we've had other men of bad character as president, but we've never had one as emotionally immature, as psychologically insecure, as profoundly ignorant as Donald Trump. So his remark that who knows what sort of men will come after George Washington.
At least he
Um,
supported vaccines on like a few weeks ago or something.
yeah, yeah. I wish he would have cared about advocating for them when it could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank God for small blessings, right?
A few weeks too late, says Keenan. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
So yeah, and also the judicial system has evolved. So um, this is a major point of contention in our system because, as I mentioned with Brown versus Board of Education, we had a big step in a different direction within the Supreme Court as to the role of the judiciary within our system of government. When I was a young graduate student in political science, one of my duties at one point was to sort through a bunch of material that a professor had gathered at at some conventions that were uh, attended by conservative Christian organizations. A lot of them were evangelical organizations, like you would think of Southern evangelical Christian organizations, Baptists, and the like. But some of them were also conservative Catholics. So, but they had these literature. A lot of it was like pamphlets, kind of like the pamphlets of the early days of our history with Thomas Paine writing, the kind of stuff that he wrote. So they were pamphlets trying to persuade people to their point of view that attended those kinds of conferences, and they were from the conservative standpoint. Um, and a lot of them focused on the judicial system at that time, what they called judicial activism. The centerpiece of their opposition, the centerpiece of their anger was Roe v. Wade. But that was not the cornerstone of their intellectual critique. That was not the cornerstone of their attack. The cornerstone of their criticism of judicial activism was the first decision that was considered to be the origin of judicial activism within the 20th century, which was Brown versus Board of Education. So even though that was a unanimous decision, for decades after that, there was a desire to overturn that decision. Um, there was a wish that they could get enough cultural conservatives on the court that they could overrule it or eviscerate it in the way that they have done with Roe v. Wade without actually overruling Roe v. Wade in more recent years. So it's interesting in a sense because now when conservative judicial nominees are being considered for the Supreme Court, um, they won't say that they have any opposition to Brown versus Board of Education. Um, why do I not remember the name of the most recent nominee? I should know her name.
Amy Coney Barrett or
Yes, right.
Oh God.
When Judge Barrett was being when she was going through her confirmation hearings, she recognized Brown versus Board of Education as a super precedent, a precedent that could not be overruled. And she would not say anything critical about it. And interestingly, some of the other right to privacy cases that were the basis for Roe v. Wade, the Griswold case, for instance, she still referred to them as the kinds of precedents that the court needed to adhere to or not overrule. So she wasn't willing to go as far as saying that the states can now outlaw contraception, for instance. But in the days when I was reading those pamphlets, those types of polemical writings by conservative Christians, they were still opposed to Brown versus Board of Education. This was in the 80s. This was in the middle of the 1980s. So 30 years after that case had been decided unanimously, they still wanted it to be overturned because it was indicative of judicial activism that they abhorred. Um, and one has to recognize that that was a profoundly significant change in our in our political system, in our socio-political system. Um, because at that point and from that point thereafter, not only did they expand the meaning of the 14th Amendment, but they began to basically do what conservatives hate, what they call legislation from the bench. They were basically saying, these are policies These are policies that the legislature could have enforced, that they could have enacted. They didn't. And our system, our cultural system is falling behind. Our political system is not fulfilling its obligations, its responsibility to spur it forward, to spur our social cultural system forward. And we're going to do it because we know, based upon, in their case, they looked at actual social science data in the differences in the quality of education between people who were integrated and segregated in the school systems. And they recognize that there's empirical evidence, overwhelming empirical evidence, that segregation does not enable that separate but equal is not a meaningful concept that can actually be fulfilled. That separate is always going to be unequal in that kind of a situation with respect to the educational system. So they said the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson is absurd, and we're going to be realists about our society, and we're going to implement a policy as a judiciary. That was a pretty significant step forward, uh, similar to the Marbury versus Madison step forward. Now, I'm happy they did that, but it would be naive for liberals to think that that wasn't profoundly important, and that conservatives who are culturally conservative and don't want that kind of forward movement in society to occur by legislative dictate, in effect, from the bench, from the judiciary, they have a point. That that's not the role that the judiciary had played previously in our system, and they weren't happy about it because it meant that before the most momentous civil rights legislation of the 1960s was passed, that the courts were saying to the South that, hey, you're backwards. Culturally, you're backwards. Get into the modern society. Don't think that you can continue to sustain apartheid um, as a social structural system that can be considered stable for the long run. It's going to break down, and we're going to be part of breaking it down. So that was pretty upsetting. Now, I wouldn't say probably that the conservative Catholics were opposed to that in their polemical writings, but evangelical Christians, which predominated the South, were predominantly from the South, were still opposed to Brown versus Board of Education at that point. They still asserted states' rights, that states should have the rights to to establish their own social structure, in effect, even if it deviated from the moral standards of the society as a whole. So, yeah, there was evolution beyond the electoral system. There was evolution beyond the legislative system that was most directly affected by the electoral system. But meaningful contestable elections were the core of the ways in which our system evolved, the way in which the unwritten Constitution evolved. Uh, so I've mentioned already that we approached substantive democracy over time. And part of it was, the crossing of property thresholds. I mentioned that. And over time, in part maybe because of a desire to build majority coalitions, or partly just because of an appeal to a higher sense of moral standards, uh, people would um, advocate for the reduction of property requirements. And then with the 15th Amendment, we had the formal enfranchisement of black voters. Uh, Later, we had an amendment for the women to be eligible to vote. And ultimately, through a variety of efforts, some Supreme Court decisions, and ultimately also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we had a broad based, across the country, enfranchisement of black voters. And that got us as close towards a democratic republic as we had ever been up to that point. And by continuing efforts to improve the ways in which people can vote, and by efforts to get people registered to vote, uh, we've continued to increase the font size of democratic and democratic republic and bring it closer to the ideal of that concept. Um, as for approaching a republic, we made strides when we implemented direct election of senators for a very long time until my constitutional amendment. We instantiated direct election of senators. Senators were elected by the state legislatures. So again, you had political elites selecting political elites, even after more people were eligible to vote. Generally, the representatives in the state legislatures, because often they weren't paid or were paid very little, had to be people who could afford to be in the legislative sessions for however long they lasted, um, on the basis of their own saved money, their independent wealth. So the political elites in the state legislatures were generally still economic elites, even up to the point where we implemented direct election of senators. So not surprisingly, they tended to elect economic elites to the Senate. It's not the case that we have really very many working class senators now, or even that many working class representatives, but particularly less so in the Senate than in the House. Um, but just having direct election of senators allowed everybody who could vote to be able to participate democratically within the selection of those senators, even if the political elites were still not very democratic in origin and their identity. We still had movement towards a republic by doing that, by having people be able to vote for candidates, directly vote for candidates who at least advocated for the interests, or said that they, as campaigners, said that they were going to advocate for their interests. And true enough, in the South, you had the rise of some demagoguery with Huey Long, the Kingfish, and other people like him who went directly after the working class vote once direct election of senators was in place, pursuing their votes because they would advocate for policies that would be in their interest, in the interest of the working class, trying to get those votes. And because oftentimes those voters, the working class voters, were the least informed, um, the most effective persuasive techniques were often demagogic in nature. Um, but on the whole, it was a stride forward towards a more complete democratic republic system. Um, also, the the courts ended up ultimately imposing restrictions on gerrymandering. Um, that kind of got shunted aside from. It's really the responsibility of Congress to deal with gerrymandering, but they kind of shunted that responsibility to the courts because both sides did it. Both Democrat and Republican legislatures would engage in gerrymandering. Everybody knows what gerrymandering is, right? I don't need to explain that. If
I'm
you don't
pretty
know, just
sure everyone knows.
I would hope so.
yeah. If you don't know, just ask. So both political parties engaged in that. So neither party wanted to take upon themselves the responsibility of restricting it by congressional action. So they shunted that responsibility to the courts. Well, the Roberts Court recently said, it's not on us. We can't do anything about political gerrymandering. We can still do stuff about racial gerrymandering and that kind of thing, but not political gerrymandering. So if you guys want to deal with that, you figure out how to deal with it, Congress. So we're in that situation now where if that's going to be tamped down, it's going to have to be done by Congress one way or another. Um, the two voting rights bills that are before the Senate right now are intended to try to protect the expansive voting rights that people have acquired in recent decades, but they're also intended to um, restrict the capacity of states to engage in effective political gerrymandering, that is partisan gerrymandering. Um, let's see. I'll look at my notes here. Okay, so as we've become closer to being a democratic republic, granted, a lot of the obstacles to becoming a more democratic republic were perpetrated by members of the Democratic Party, by political elites of the Democratic Party. But with the kinds of socio-political transformations that have occurred in the last few decades, is that somebody beeping again? Somebody want to say something, or I just heard a beep in my.
Oh, Skylar has a question about alternative mechanism of classifying people in a republic.
Okay, we'll do that.
You
If
wanted
if it takes us too much off, if it's too tangential, we'll stop.
okay.
But I'd like to hear the question.
All right.
I like questions. I like contributions.
I invited you to speak, Skylar. Skylar.
Skylar, are you muted? You got your hand up
No.
still.
He hasn't accepted my invitation yet.
Okay.
It
There
was
we
showing
go.
up on my other monitor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I had a question. So you said the purpose of the Republic government is to represent the interests of different groups of people.
Yeah, I think that the modern conception of a republic is that that wasn't the conception at the time of the formation of our system of government, but it's the modern conception of a republic.
Okay, so is there possibly another mechanism of classifying people other than geographically that you think would be more appropriate?
Oh, I think that I'm not quite sure what you're getting at, but what I mean by what I'm saying is that people basically have interests that they pursue. A lot of them are economic interests, but they could have other types of interests that are associated with their social background, their cultural background, their gender, et cetera, things like that. So, as long as all of those interests are able to be equitably and effectively pursued within the institutional systems that we have within the political system, then you have basically a republic. What you're saying, I guess your question is not that idea, but how can we organize the voting process itself? Is that what you mean geographically? Or
Yes, I
what do you
believe
mean by
I believe I was understanding. I was misunderstanding what you were.
okay. Yeah, so from my standpoint, a meaningful republic and a modern conception of it is one in which all the variety of interests of the people who make up society are effectively represented within the institutional processes that comprise our political system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes
Okay.
sense. Thank you.
Okay. Do you have anything else you want to say?
You're doing a great job.
Well, that's nice of you to say. Do you feel like that I'm saying anything you don't already know from your classes, or is there anything new here, or is it all stuff that's old
Yeah,
hat to you?
quite a bit actually.
Okay.
Learn a lot.
I feel like most classes are not nearly this in depth.
No, sometimes you say stuff, but it's like, you guys know about this law, and I'm like, no, I don't. But then you pick it up through context afterwards as well. You'd be surprised how base level like U.S. history
Yeah.
and government is in high school in the United States.
Yeah, one of my complaints, I probably had it somewhere I don't know what part of the outline I was gonna say this in, but this really pisses me off actually, because to have an effective democracy, you really need an informed citizenry.
Oh yeah.
And it irritates me to no end that we have one semester of government taught in school. And it's not like that's a new thing. That's the way it was when I was going to school. That's the way it was when my parents went to school, if they even had one semester, right, of civics education. And in my opinion, you need at least 2 full years just to cover the constitutional rights that people have, just to cover the electoral process and the way in which elections actually function, the biases in the electoral system, et cetera, to focus on the way the institutional processes work. How do bills actually get implemented? And the days when I was, a graduate student, I mean, when I studied Congress, a lot of focus was on the markups of bills within congressional committees and the conference committees between the House and the Senate. That stuff doesn't even happen now. The bills are written in the speaker's office or in the majority leader's office. There are still occasional markups to bills, but it's nothing like what occurred decades ago. Our system has become a emaciated version of its previous self, and it has become dysfunctional as a result. But all of that kind of stuff, how the processes work, that stuff takes time. You can't learn all of that in one semester. That's absurd. So to me, it's ridiculous that they teach one semester in civics and think that the citizenry is going to be informed. In my opinion, they should teach it every year from sixth grade on, from middle school on. That's what I
No,
would prefer.
no, no, don't make me take more government.
That's what I would prefer. But it would be more interesting if they didn't have to do such a dumbed down, oversimplified version of it, right?
I think they
Do you find do you,
focus.
do you
I
find
find
history interesting?
it focuses on useless stuff. Like I mean obviously like the way the governmental system forms is great and all, but we've done that every year since 8th grade. Like I don't need to do that again. Like it and then like not to say slavery isn't an issue, and I think many of my friends may have heard me brought this up before. Um, they go through the process of teaching us about the entire history of slavery every year in every class. We do it once in English and then once in whatever social studies class we have. Like in world history. I mean, world history is actually important because you learn about the history of slavery across the world. But then U.S. history, you spend like a full like 2 or 3 months on it, and then in English you read um 12 Years a Slave, which is again fine, but then we shouldn't be doing it again and again when that's something like that. It doesn't. It of course okay. Again, it affects our lives now. CRT is definitely still important. I'm not trying to downplay its influence, but I'm saying that we should be focusing on that. Like we should be focusing on how this can currently affect us and how we should be thinking about moving on. But then instead, shut up, Skylar. Skylar said to privatize the school system, Mister ANCAP. But yeah, it feels like we keep on hitting the same points. Like we hit the Industrial Revolution and what it did for the United States really hard every time. We hit the Manifest Destiny really hard every time. But it's like, why would you do that when, like, I don't know what the Electoral College is. Explain that. Like the school. I know it exists, and I know it has like significant amounts of influence in the election because Trump got elected with not a majority. But I don't know how it works, and I certainly can tell you that U.S. history and all up until only in senior year do you learn when it works, which I mean makes sense. But this should be hammered into you
That's
until
my point.
yeah,
The concepts need to be reinforced. You're not going to remember everything effectively from one time is covered. Um, at least average students don't, right? So you need a lot of reinforcement of the most critical stuff. So yeah, I understand what you're saying about it. I mean, you feel like you've learned a lot about the early slavery history of our country, and you feel like you don't need to have it repeated. From my point of view, I'd rather we spent more time on. I mean, I think we need to spend time on that, but I understand if you think it's redundant, that I wouldn't mind if they had converted to spending more time on the failure of Reconstruction after the Civil War,
exactly.
the the ability of the states to effectively nullify federal law in that respect,
I'd like to note that
nullify the
it is
Constitution.
taught that Reconstruction worked pretty well, and like while people were still like xenophobic, Reconstruction was largely successful. That's like kind of the idea, which
Well,
eh,
it was successful in readmitting the Southern states into the Union.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And then it failed in pretty much every other regard. It
yeah,
it
there are.
did it did its bare minimum. It worked.
Yeah, that's probably. I don't know if I do more podcasts that are related to the overall threat of the authoritarian slide, where I talk about the social cultural transformations and the socio political transformations. One of the things that I might talk about is the failure of Reconstruction. Um, I don't know how long I'll want to make those. This one's probably turning out to be longer than you guys want. So,
No, I
uh,
anticipated it would take a while.
yeah. So if I do more, I don't know what I will include or won't include, but I might talk a little bit about. I will have to say something about Reconstruction because, in my opinion, we will have to employ one of the techniques.
Oh yeah, I
Uh,
wanted you to mention this. I forgot to tell you earlier. I
I'm not going
wanted
to
you to
talk
bring it
about
up.
it.
Okay.
No, I don't want to talk about it in this podcast.
I think it
When
wouldn't take
we
that long at the end to do,
Yeah, I
but
wanna save it for when we talk about how we can save our country, which is gonna be
part
in one of
2 or
the other
whatever.
podcasts.
All right.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So, but we'll have to talk about Reconstruction because I'll need to talk about what Congress did at that time that enabled our society to potentially advance then, and ultimately did advance in the 20th century substantially because of some acts that were taken, some decisions that Congress made during the Reconstruction era very early on. And so we'll have to talk about it at least to that extent. How much more we'll go into the failure of it over the longer run, I'm not sure. We'll see. Um, any more you want to say about that, Derek?
Not really.
So anyway, my
I'm
point
just
though is
angry about it in general, but
I just feel like people should get a lot of reinforcement and a lot of knowledge about our political system in order for our system to work as effectively as it can in principle as a democratic republic. Let me ask you this: you stopped Australian school in seventh grade, but your brother is a couple years older than you, right?
I stopped Australian school in the middle of 8th grade.
Okay, and you're because they have a different time of the year that they do it because of summer, winter, or
Yeah. Because
okay, and you're
I left at the beginning of the American school year, which was in the middle of.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, and so your brother was a couple years ahead of you, right?
Mhm.
So he got into like 10th grade or something.
Yes.
Okay, so do you know from his experience how much civics education they did in Australia relative to the United States, compared to the United
Uh,
States?
I can tell you how much I did. I don't know how much he did. Um, what I can tell you is that Australian science, like core courses, you don't get to choose your cores. You just take the core courses, the four. You take social studies, you take math, you take science, you take English. You take them every year. Um, and so social studies then is much more like well laid out. Because that means you learn history and politics and government in tandem with each other.
Okay,
So it
so
was very
all
like,
one, all part of one big system.
yeah, all part of one huge system. It was like we learned. We basically started. No, we didn't basically start. The high school social studies education started basically a little bit before the Industrial Revolution and everything leading up to that. So it started with the U.S. kind of like it wasn't focusing on the U.S., but then talked about the French Revolution and then like the establishment of the British parliamentary system, the establishment of the United States parliamentary system. Well, no, I wouldn't call that parliament then. How Australia mimics both of those in a different way, and then it like so yeah, and then it moves into the actual Industrial Revolution, how it affected each of the Britain, America, and Australia, the only three places that matter according to Australia, and then a light touch over on Europe, and then like yeah, and then you basically continue with world history, and then every time something like political comes up in world history, you take that and then you talk about it,
Okay,
and
so
you
it's
continue.
integrated within the
Mhm.
social processes. Generally, are all
Yeah,
integrated.
you don't have like 1 year where you like suddenly you're like, okay, to this year we're doing government, and then you start again from the start doing government because
Right.
that's inefficiency. That's
Yeah, I
like
kind of like that approach too. It is like here it's kind of redundant. You get like you didn't experience it, but you get like Texas history in fourth grade or something like that, and then again
yeah,
seventh
so I
grade.
heard, and then you get it again in 7th grade.
You
I know
get U.S. history.
Mr. Lemons complained about having to teach Texas history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of states have a state history, but I don't know if it's repeated. I mean, reinforcement is part of the educational system. Spiraling is a strategy within education as far as like getting the basics and then extending and making it more in depth over time. But you've already got familiarized with it, at a previous grade level or whatever. So I understand the advantage of that. I think that they should just do more of that with civics. And it's
Mhm.
fine with me if they put more emphasis on the evolution of the political system. But in history, they should be teaching that, right? They should be teaching the evolution of the political system. But, ultimately, I would like more emphasis on the way it functions within the last half a century, within the last 50 years or so, and what changes have occurred within the last 50 years. So, modern American history, in a sense, but at the same time, I think it's better if people understand what the processes are, why things work the way they do, what the complaints are with the way they do. It doesn't have to be, you know, a liberal perspective or whatever. I think you need to deal with stuff like, this was a pretty profound change in the judicial system to make the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, and the activism that followed that ensued, made the Warren Court, made Chief Justice Warren in particular a hated person by a large part of the country. President Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren. Earl Warren was a politician more so than a jurist. He had been the governor of California. He was such an effective politician that he ran in both the Democratic and the Republican primary and won them both. So he was a politician before he was appointed by Eisenhower to be the Chief Justice. Um, and later in life, Eisenhower said that was the biggest mistake he had ever made. because of judicial activism. So conservatives have had for decades a vigorous complaint. Now that decision's been accepted by Amy Coney Barrett and other conservative jurists that want to get on the Supreme Court because they dare not say that we should go back to segregation. But for a long period of time, that was an open debate. So um, people need to hear both sides of these things. They need to understand what's the basis for the criticism of the transformations that have occurred, and what is the argument for further transformations that have not yet occurred. But those debates need to be somewhat more thorough than they can do in one semester of a civics course. So I don't like that aspect of our system. But I'm homeschooling Jazz, so guess what? He's interested in this stuff. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to teach him a bunch of it. so
Yeah.
so I get to do what I want.
Seems like it's
And
what
he's
he wants to do anyways, so.
right. So okay, so let's see back if I can remember where I was at on that. So I think I was getting to the point where I was talking about it was kind of related to what Keenan said about Wayrich. So the Democratic retrenchment by Republicans is what I had written down. Um, so as we became closer to being a democratic republic, um, and as the shifts had taken place within our political system, so that the Democrats they had basically lost a lot of their voters in the South, or were in the process of losing them. So the Republican Party was picking up a lot of those voters, and they wanted to pursue the interests of economic elites more effectively within the political system. And when we get into the other podcasts, I'll deal with this in more depth. But at some point, they decided that one of the best strategies they could pursue was to try to place obstacles in the way of any more progress towards being a complete democratic republic. And that's where you get the Wayrich comment that Keenan referred to. They wanted fewer people to vote, and whatever they could do to make it less likely for people to vote was to their advantage. They understood that given the way in which the society was changing, that if that the Schachtschneider point that guy I mentioned earlier that I'd read when I was a first semester graduate student, if he was correct and we could get more people to vote, then that spelled doom for the most advantaged people in society who had had it pretty much their way in history up to that point, within our political system up to that point. So, and Wayrich was one of those in the Republican Party who was a traditional Republican who still wanted to serve the interests of the economic elite. That story of the transformation of the Republican Party to get to where it is now is a little bit too complicated for me to get into right now. We'll do that in another podcast. But I just want to hit on the idea that at that point, they started to think about what they could do um, to bias the electorate in their favor. They were thinking about it back in the 80s, like Wayrich was. But in particular, it became a matter of greater paramount importance in the early part of the 2000s. So one thing is that people should understand with respect to Republican strategists is that they know that when more people vote, they lose, in the sense that they know that from 1992 up until the most recent election in 2020, that the Democratic candidate received more votes than in presidential elections. I'm sorry, let me clarify that. In presidential elections from 1992 up to 2020, that the Democratic presidential candidate received more votes than the Republican presidential candidate in every single one of those elections except for 2004. And 2004 was still in the fairly early stages of the occupation of Iraq after the invasion of Iraq under George W. Bush. And then he only won by a small margin. And if institutional processes for voting had been more fair in Ohio, to where people in Cleveland could have had a fairer chance to vote, he probably would have won a plurality of the vote, a popular vote majority, but he would have lost the electoral college vote. The Democratic candidate, John Kerry, probably would have won an electoral victory without winning a plurality of the vote in that election, kind of the way Trump did in 2016 in the other direction. Um, So they understood by that time, after that election, that they knew that that election was too close, considering that we were in the early stages of a war, and that normally the electorate rallies around the troops and rallies around the president that is responsible for getting us into the war in the early stages of a war. So they knew that they were in dire straits as demographic changes continue to occur. In part, that has to do with the increasing proportion of our society that is uh, ethnic minorities or cultural minorities, but in part, it was just a recognition that young voters were increasingly likely to be Democratic voters, and that they were more likely to sustain that voting tendency throughout the length of their lives. And so they understood that they were not going to be able to win elections over the long run. That recognition has never receded. So even though at that point the political elites within the Republican Party, the traditional Republicans, we're still committed to our political system. We're still committed to meaningful contestable elections. In recent years, there's been um, a larger proportion of the Republican Party political elites, not necessarily traditional Republicans in that sense, but the newly formed political elites as the Republican Party has changed, spurred substantially by Trump's success in 2016. Um, a substantial number of those elites recognize that in the long run, they cannot win if meaningful contestable elections continue. And that is the motivation for moving from democracy into authoritarianism. But even before that, there was a retrenchment, an attempt to retrench the effectiveness of the democratic processes. Um, so part of it, I've already talked about some of this, so I'm not going to go into it in too much more detail. But they've tried to restrict voting in various ways, either by, like I mentioned, by different kinds of restrictions on eligibility to vote, or uh, needing to produce certain kinds of IDs, but other IDs being acceptable. You know, in Texas, you can vote with a gun ownership license, but you can't vote with an electric bill or a student ID or other things in some states. I can't remember if Texas has student IDs allowed or not, but some states the students can't vote with student IDs. Um, so they've used those kinds of techniques to just obstruct people's ability, their capacity to vote as a formal matter. But they've also tried to do what they did in Cleveland in Ohio in 2004. That's been a long tried and true method. What they did there basically was not to allow the county and the precincts within the county to have a sufficient number of voting machines for everybody to have the ability to vote within the time frame. So in areas that were particularly heavily black voting areas, they just didn't have enough voting machines. So black voters had to stand in line extraordinarily long amounts of time in order to be able to vote, and just too many will give up under those circumstances. If voting is that incredibly inconvenient, um, they just won't. People just won't. Some people are just stubborn and they will. And fortunately, for Democratic electoral victories in Georgia last year in the Senate, a lot of black voters have learned to be very stubborn in spite of the insufficiency of the machinery available to them for voting. So somebody is it beeping again? Is somebody
Yeah,
trying to?
Keenan has a thing he wants to talk about.
Okay.
Kareem is just putting out the worst opinions I've ever seen in my life.
Who?
Kareem.
Who?
No, nothing. So Keenan wants to talk about court packing.
Okay.
So I'm gonna invite him to speak.
Okay.
Also, I have Jazz told me about an opinion of yours that
Uh-oh.
Wait, let Keenan write it down, Derek, and then let Keenan ask his question
I
first.
don't worry, I remember what it is.
So,
Okay.
First of all, regarding the Supreme Court, right? Clearly, like a member serving their entire life in the court, especially like it doesn't reflect what the country really wants, because after, let's just say, 10 years, how that person interprets. I don't know. Sorry. Hold on a second. It's just that. So Biden recently, or not Biden, there was this. It was more of a joke that Biden should encourage court packing, but I kind of took it seriously because the Supreme Court, it kind of falls into that narrative where it isn't really democratic at this point, right? I was just wondering what your opinion on court packing was.
Yeah. So it never really was democratic. I mean, it was always. for most of our history, the Supreme Court was more elitist than the elites. For most of our history, it was more elitist than the political elites within the legislature and the executive branch. It was, they were usually, on average, the ages were often older, and their commitment to their cultural background was just pretty intense, and so it generally lagged behind. So that's why you would get the Dred Scott decision, or Plessy versus Ferguson, or other abhorrent decisions that characterized the Supreme Court for a lot of our history. In the early stages, it was pretty much irrelevant. I mean, it didn't do anything important until, as far as I can think of, really much of importance until Marbury versus Madison. And even after then, it didn't hear that many cases. It took a long time for our governmental system to kind of develop a significant role within society. And so it took a long time for the courts to have much to do that were really profoundly important. But when they did, it was usually negative until the 20th century. In the 20th century, they started to be more expansive with the rights of people. And that was true not just with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but it was also true with expanding the meaning of the First Amendment, for instance. So freedom of speech became way more expansive than just political expression, which was the intent of the First Amendment originally was just to protect political expression, not all kinds of speech. So they expanded its meaning to anything that basically had any social merit, any potential social value whatsoever. So even when they were deciding cases on obscenity, basically, they would watch the movies, watch the films, and if they could find any meaningful social content at all, then it was permissible speech in spite of the obscenity laws in the local jurisdictions. So freedom of speech got expanded quite a bit in the 20th century too. But really, it wasn't until the 20th century that it started to become a contributing factor to the liberalization of our society. And the judicial activism of the Warren Court was very significant to that. Now, in reference to the current court, which is a 6-3 conservative court, the Warren Court was not especially ideological in that sense. It was more about wanting to progress the society. It wasn't so much about being ideologically liberal or conservative or Democratic or Republican. They always had, a variety of justices on the court representing those points of view. Justices tended, as they aged on the court, to go from conservative towards liberal, which is a phenomenon among elites in general, or the educated public if they get enough access to information. In general, as people acquire, if people have enough knowledge and are open to acquiring new knowledge, they tend to go from conservative to liberal. Historically, in the populace as a whole, that wasn't true. Within the middle,
claiming that educated people are more liberal.
I'm claiming that as people acquire more knowledge, they tend to become more liberal. Now, what I would say is that
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
What I would say is that in the populace as a whole, I told this to Jazz when I was young. One of my conservative friends told me that a professor, said this to the class. It was a commonly said thing. The professor said to the class that if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative when you're old, you have no brain. So in the populace as a whole, that was the truism, right? That as people went from youth to a later period in their life when they had more personal vested interest in their material well-being, as they had more career success, they would go from believing the idealism of liberals to protecting their status in society as conservatives. And so that was the truism for the populace as a whole. I think there was a lot of truth to that at that time. But it was always the case that among the most educated people in society that were still open to continuing to develop their knowledge, that as they acquire more knowledge, they tend to become more liberal. I'm not going to say that that's true in every instance, but it's but of the people that I've known who were conservative, as they acquired more knowledge, they became more liberal. And that was, and really the point that I was trying to make was that, what's going on?
I'm just muting this.
Jazz is muting my beeps or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the with respect to the Supreme Court, as justices aged and acquired more, they were exposed to so many different kinds of cases and so many different kinds of arguments in the briefs that they read, and so many different kinds of arguments and the oral arguments that were made by brilliant attorneys. And then of the discussions that they would have with each other in deciding the outcomes of the cases, and then they would exchange briefs with each other. They would write their opinions and their points of view and exchange that stuff with each other over a period of weeks or months before they would come to their final voting decisions. Um, so they were just exposed to so much variety of thinking, so much dissent, so many different orientations towards the specific issues that they were encountering, that they decided to lock in on when they decided that a particular case was worth taking. That they just became more open-minded and knowledgeable, and as that happened, they became more liberal, almost to a man, and ultimately to a woman with respect to Justice O'Connor. So that's just the normal pattern. It's more dramatic or more evident with some justices than with others, but it was a trend that was evident. I forgot why I said that. So I was going to say something about, you were asking about the justice of the Supreme Court now. What I wanted to say is that judicial activism was characteristic of a court that moved the society towards the liberal direction, towards a more democratic Republican society, but a society in which a larger variety of people had more equity within the society. They had more opportunities for themselves. They had more freedom of choices and actions within the society. And that was something that generally the liberal ideologues were in favor of. So the courts kind of moved society in that direction, in the liberal direction during the Warren era. The current, and so they were called judicial activists, but the current court I refer to as the hyperactivists. They're way more activist than the Warren court ever was. They have more things they're trying to accomplish. They're trying to roll back our culture. They're trying to undo legislation that has been passed by Congress or state legislatures. They're trying to legislate themselves to overrule legislation that might be contemplated by Congress or state legislatures. They're trying to overrule or eviscerate the Supreme Court precedents that they don't like. They are in pursuit of their ideological objectives, fully with no stop, full tilt. They want to pursue their ideological objectives, and they are determined to get what they want. The institutional norms are not just shattering within the legislative system, not just shattering within the executive system. They are shattering, maybe even more overtly, more obviously, more distinctively, within the judiciary right now, within the Supreme Court. It is unbelievable the way in which they are trying to pursue their ideological objectives with no inhibitions, no normative restrictions whatsoever. It's shocking, really. But I, as a liberal, can criticize that just the way that cultural conservatives could criticize the judicial activism of the Warren Court. I just think it's ironic because once conservatives were in a position that they could actually promulgate their own decisions, they did everything that the Warren Court said. I mean, everything that the Warren Court did that they complained about, and they added so much more that they want to accomplish to roll back or regress our society culturally, as well as all the other stuff that they've attempted to do. So it's just, I call them the hyperactivists. They're just way more active than the judicial activists of the Warren Court. But anyway, let me see where I was at on that. So we were talking about the electoral system, and the other thing I wanted to say was I talked about Cleveland and other places where they've tried to make it more difficult. In Georgia right now, they've installed in the counties where there were elected Democratic election officials. They've installed their own Republican appointees in some of those offices to rule on election matters. And so there was in a county where they had multiple places where people could vote that were closer to where they lived in a rural county but it's a predominantly black county because it's one of the rural black counties that hark back to the days of plantations. And so in certain areas in the South, there were uh, a lot of a lot of plantations where the bulk of the population were black slaves. And after the abolition of slavery, a lot of the blacks still remained in those rural areas as sharecroppers or what have you. And so a lot of rural areas still have disproportionately black populations in certain states of the South. And so one of those counties, they basically just restricted all the voting to one location, which can be, you know, a fairly substantial distance from where some of the residents in the county live. So that kind of stuff is still going on. It's still strategic. There was always a strategy because it's not so obvious. It's obvious when you say, well, students at the University of Wisconsin are not allowed to vote in Wisconsin unless they also have a driver's license. So students that come to the University of Wisconsin from out of state, but have registered as voters in the state or want to vote in the state in the elections there, rather than absentee in the states from which they originated, after they've established their residential requirements. Um, if they're discouraged from voting because they can't use their student IDs, and a lot of those students didn't bother to get state driver's licenses because they're students and they don't really care about having a license within Wisconsin. So that's overt. It's obvious. It's easy to complain about those kinds of obstructive tactics, but it's way more subtle and nuanced to just like deprive people of the opportunity to vote easily. And that's the tried and true strategy that has existed for many decades that has biased the electorate, biased the types of votes that would actually get counted because it affected the choices of people to vote or not to vote. Um, and that was a strategy that was reinforced more. Both all of the strategies to try to reduce the proportion of the population that votes has been an emphasis over the last 20 years in particular. Once it became evident to even traditional Republicans that that they could not expect to win presidential elections going forward, although they could still expect to win majorities in congressional elections, in off-year elections, and the midterm elections. So in some sense, that reminded me, when I saw them starting to do that stuff. Um, with a lot of enthusiasm, with a lot of determination right after the 2004 election. It reminded me of the story of the little boy Dutch, or the little Dutch boy who would like stick his finger in the dike to stop the flooding in the cities in the Netherlands. And it just seemed to me like it was a bunch of little boys red, a bunch of little Republican reds running around trying to stick the fingers in the dikes of all the idea of the demographic change was inevitably going to wash over them and defeat them as a political party unless they made adjustments and started to moderate their views. But they didn't want to moderate their views. That was not what had worked for them as a political party. So they tried to figure out ways to bias the electorate instead. Um, Gerrymandering is another technique for biasing the outcome. So you bias the electorate, that's one technique. The other thing is to bias the outcomes. So everybody can vote, but if the gerrymandering is effective, as it has been in many states, then you're going to get a larger proportion of Republicans elected to legislative districts and congressional districts. Um, the other thing is to control the counts. So they're putting election officials into place that can control the actual count outcomes, or they're hoping that they will. They're hoping that they might be able to get some value out of that. I don't know that that will happen. I think that a lot of people, even if they are believers of the craziest aspects of Republican ideology right now, even if they take office as an election official, believing that Italian satellites have you know zapped the voting machines and caused the count to go haywire, or that the CIA was trying to uh, had organized a special forces mission in Germany to capture a server database in order to hide the evidence of the manipulation of votes from the server in Germany. I mean, some of these I mean, that one was believed and believed by one of Trump's top election lawyers, Sidney Powell, who actually contacted a Pentagon official to try to get them to get more information about that weird conspiracy that involved our CIA director, Gina Haspel, that she had apparently herself gone with the special forces and had been injured in the attack in Germany. Just wild, made up, crazy stuff. even if you get election officials who believe that wild, made up, crazy stuff, they still might have enough personal integrity that they will count the votes correctly according to the procedures by which the votes are supposed to be counted. So I'm not sure that they will be able to control the counts of the votes in the way that they would prefer. I think that a lot of people, even if they believe these crazy things, are fundamentally decent people with a level of integrity that would enable them to stand up for the democratic processes, the democratic system. That's one of my hopes. That's one of my optimisms. That's one of the mechanisms by which we might be able to save our democracy. We have to rely on election officials, even if they're appointed by Republicans, or even if they've chased out Democratic election officials from office and replaced them with Republicans electorally or by appointment. My hope is that some of those people just have enough personal integrity that they will do their job unaffected by the outcome of the election or the party that wins. I mean, we see an example of this in the audit that took place in Arizona, where you had one of those nuts who believed in the crazy stuff. They audited Maricopa County's votes. It took them like 5 months to do it with the number of people that they had doing it and the slowness of the process by which they did it. But ultimately, the guy who ran it, I mean, he was a nut who believed in crazy stuff. They used ultraviolet lights to try to, scan for I forgot what they were trying to scan for with the ultraviolet lights, but they were trying to find, like, evidence that the ballots had bamboo in them because they thought that some of the ballots had been, sent by China that were made from paper with bamboo or something. I mean, they had the weirdest, craziest ideas about why the Maricopa County votes were not correct and were fraudulent. But when they actually counted the votes, what was their ultimate conclusion? Their ultimate conclusion was that, hey, you know what? Uh, they kind of got it right. Their ultimate conclusion was that actually Trump should have gotten like 100 and something odd votes less than he got, according to the real count. So when they counted it, they counted it more or less correctly. They didn't follow the correct auditing procedures. They didn't follow the correct ballot care procedures that actual professionals would have followed, but they got the ultimate result correct. And that was people who believed in the craziest stuff who were hired to do that audit with the expectation that they would get a result that would overturn the state of Arizona for Trump. And Trump himself um, profoundly believed that that was going to be the outcome. So ultimately, people's personal integrity is the thing we have to hope for at the level of counting votes. Um, whether the Democrats or Republicans historically, either party, they've done a good job. They've done a really good job historically in counting votes accurately. There have been, biases in who was allowed to vote with literacy tests, poll tests, all that. After the Voting Rights Act was passed in Alabama, in Selma, where the Selma marches originated at where John Lewis had his head hit by batons by the highway patrolman or the National Guard, not National Guard, but by the highway patrolman, I believe, state highway patrolman who were trying to stop them from marching off of the Edmund Pettus Bridge towards Montgomery, the capital of the state, in pursuit of voting rights reforms. The Selma marches actually instigated the changes that got the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965 with the strength of comprehensiveness that it was passed with. The amount of the potency of the act was greater because of the effectiveness of those marches and getting the public's attention outside of the South. And so the next year, when blacks in Selma were allowed to register and vote, the sheriff who had been responsible for um, the attacks on the marchers um, was defeated. But when the election results were being counted, when their votes were being counted, he asked the election officials to not count two of the precincts because he knew that those were predominantly black precincts, and he knew if their votes weren't counted, he would be reelected as he had been in all the other years when the whites only voted. That's how he had gotten elected. No blacks allowed to vote. He was popular with the white voters in that county. When the blacks were allowed to vote, he wasn't popular enough to get reelected. And he knew that if those votes were counted, he would lose the election. So he asked 2 of the precincts to not have he asked the election officials to throw out the votes from 2 of those precincts that were predominantly black. He actually asked a federal judge to do the same. And I don't know if the federal judge was conservative or not, but probably. But he still stood by the rule of law in that instance and ruled that those votes had to be counted. And he lost his election as a result. So in general, Republican, Democrat, even in the South, even where you had Democratic election office election officials who were probably bigoted, who were probably racist, who had been put into office by the white majorities before blacks were allowed to vote. Ultimately, they did the right thing and they counted the votes accurately. So that is my greatest hope, that somehow it plays out like that over the next couple of elections throughout the country, and that we can salvage our democracy. But that's not the only thing that matters for saving our democracy. So my hopes are not very robust, and I am more pessimistic than optimistic. And the final thing I would say is that even if the votes are counted accurately, the other thing they're trying to do is to prevent electoral counts that favor Democrats in key situations from being certified. And that was part of the ploy of 2020 in the presidential election. They tried to get evenly divided electoral boards to not certify elections. So in Michigan, for instance, they tried to get Wayne County, where Detroit is, to not have their vote certified. And so most election boards throughout the country are composed of equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. And their role has been formal, ritualistic, perfunctory, irrelevant, really, to the substance of the outcome. The substance is the counting of the votes itself, the voting process, the counting of the votes. That's the substance. Their role has just been ritualistic historically. But they're evenly divided boards, and the objective there in 2020 in Michigan was to get that county's votes not certified, so that if those counties' votes were not counted, that Trump would have more votes than Biden, and the legislature then would have a basis for trying to overturn the correct electoral outcome of the state. So that's the last gasp effort. If the votes are counted accurately, if they can't bias the electorate effectively, if they can't obstruct the voting effectively, if the votes are counted accurately, if the gerrymandering is not sufficient with respect to congressional elections, although it probably will be with respect to congressional elections, but if the other mechanisms that they're trying to use to get the outcomes that they desire are ineffective, then ultimately they don't want the votes to be certified. So in Michigan, in Wayne County, there was a Republican who voted to certify the vote and quoted John Adams that this was a country of laws, not of men, and that he needed to follow the law, that the board needed to follow the law, and they needed to certify these accurately voted. They needed to certify these accurately counted votes of legitimately eligible voters, and so he certified the vote. He's thrown out of office. He's lost his position on that board. So throughout the country, board after board after board, they're trying to verify that they will put in place people who will not allow the outcomes to be certified if they are not the outcomes they desire. We have a former senator, Senator Perdue, who at one point was basically a traditional Republican, maybe with, the modern cultural conservative overtones of being from the South, would have been a Democrat in the 1950s or the 1940s, as a Republican now, and was more or less a standard Republican as a senator. He lost his election last year in the runoff in 2020, and so he probably wanted to run for reelection again for election again as a Senate candidate, with a hope that he would win in a midterm. But Trump put pressure on him to run for governor. Why? They have a Republican governor who did everything he could when he was Secretary of State to bias the elections in his favor to make sure he won the election as governor, and he won by a tremendously small margin. Probably could not have won without the biases that he implemented as Secretary of State. But ultimately, as governor, he didn't overturn the election in Georgia in favor of Trump. nor did the Secretary of State currently holding that office. So they're running people who say explicitly in their campaign commercials that they would not have certified the electoral slate for Biden from Georgia, in spite of the fact that there's no doubt after 4 or 5 recounts in Georgia that Biden actually had the majority of the vote. So trying to control the certification of the vote is the last gasp, most critical aspect of distributing their authority across the society, across the political systems around the society, in order to try to get the outcomes in the political system that they want. Okay, so I want to move on. I really have talked way longer than I expected. Are you guys okay with this, or you want to quit?
Yeah,
or
this is fun.
you're fine to keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I have something I wanted to discuss with you because I thought it was very interesting that you thought this.
Oh wait, is this the Bernie thing, Derek?
It is the Bernie thing.
Can we
This
wait
is
till the
Bernie
end for
thing.
that? Because I want to do that and what Anthony. Yeah, because
Okay, that's the
that
Bernie
is
thing.
like not particularly relevant, and neither is Anthony's. But I think
it's
both
kind
them
of
are-
relevant.
I think
It's
both
like
of them
a-
are worth discussing.
Okay, all right, whatever, sure.
is it the Bernie would have won 2016
Yeah.
kind of thing?
Yeah, that's what.
Okay, I'm
yeah.
gonna save that for the next podcast. That is part of the socio-political transformations that have occurred. Okay, so I want to deal with the way in which our states have realigned their party orientation, first across the South, but now across the Midwest, the Rust Belt of the Midwest. I didn't expect that, but it's happened, and it's concerning for Democrats. They need to be worried about it. But the Bernie thing versus Trump, that's part of that discussion, and I can't go into that much detail. It will take me like 30 minutes to talk about that by itself. Okay, so I just have to lay a lot of background down before I talk about that. So I don't have time for it in this one. I've already taken forever. I can't believe how long I've taken on this. I didn't expect it to take this long. Sorry. The next thing I want to talk about is the disintegration of the norms among political elites. I might have to shorten this up a little bit and talk more about it later in another podcast so we can get through this. The most important thing I want to say about this, about the disintegration of norms among political elites, is that norms are a restriction on our behavior in a sense, right? So when I talk to Jazz about all kinds of social phenomena or whatever, not social phenomena, any kinds of phenomena, any domain of study, chemistry, biology, whatever, I tend to think about the processes that are ongoing, right? So I tend to think about what I call structured processes. It's kind of redundant because every process is structured or it wouldn't be a process. But it helps to remind me when I call it a structured process that the structure itself shapes the sequence of outcomes. So the structure, in effect, and this is true for logical structures as well, mathematical structures, etc., it precludes certain outcomes. It makes them effectively impossible. And so if you took a random system and you make some things impossible, other things have to become much more probable. So in biology, this is very important, right? You have to have structured processes to get outcomes to occur within a certain time frame in order for the sequence of events to be effective for, say, a cell to effectively perform certain tasks that it has to perform for its self sustenance, for it to sustain itself. So you have to have, but the biological processes are not like human processes. They're not like social processes because humans think, purposefully. They think strategically, but cells don't, right? So individual cells don't think that way. They don't have thinking capacity. So their processes are random in effect, right? It's chemical processes that give rise to random events within the cell. So the structure basically biases the outcomes in favor of certain things being much more probable than other outcomes. And so you can get, if you have a high enough probability of certain types of events occurring, that within some time frame, they're almost guaranteed to occur. And so then you could have other things relying on events occurring within some time frame. And so you can get a hierarchically structured process that way. So our biological systems are very elaborately organized, hierarchically structured processes. But analogously, social processes are like that too. The difference is that in social processes, you do have purposeful thinking, you have purposeful efforts, you have strategic choices that are being made. So, but still, I like to think of the way in which structure works, and in our own cognitive system, our own neurological system, our brain processes are very structured. It's not random, right? We're very much more probable to think of some things than other things. It's very much more probable. It's much more likely. So our beliefs, our attitudes, our prejudices, our bigotries, our norms, our moral standards, etc. All of that stuff. All of those constitute structures that inform our thinking. They direct our thinking. They shape the way in which the neurons fire to get epiphenomenal thought concepts, etc. Um, and norms are like that too. They restrict our behavior. So when we have norms that people accept, that they're allegiant to, that they're loyal to, they won't engage in certain kinds of behavioral practices. They won't engage in arbitrarily picking and choosing a particular way to behave. So breaking down our norms, the disintegration of our norms, um, increases the ability of the political elites to pick and choose procedures and rules. So within our institutional processes, you ultimately have to have sequences of procedures and rules being followed, and in order to get to a ritualistic event that essentially defines or asserts the outcome. The substance is what matters, right? The substance of the law, the way in which the law is written and will be implemented to alter things in society, are the substance of what matters. But you've got to get there through a ritualistic set of procedures and rules that are accepted by the individuals within the legislative bodies to acquire a particular outcome that has substantive merit, has substantive effect. Um, but there's lots of rules and procedures to choose from, and some can be ignored, and others emphasized as paramount. And when the norms about which ones are to be followed are broken down, if they disintegrate, then you have a pick and choose situation in which strategic choices can be made. Uh, it can look arbitrary. It can look like it's random in a sense because you've broken down the limitations on the choices that are available to people. And so they're much more likely to make effective strategic choices when they're not attached to norms than when they are. And that's one of the constraints within the system that enabled it to hang together, that enabled it to stick together as the system evolved from the formation of the written constitution and the earliest vestiges of the flesh and organs of the unwritten constitution. One of the things that enabled it to stick together was the procedures and rules that were implemented within the House of Representatives and within the Senate, and the norms that developed and grew up and that people accepted. When they came into the body, they were socialized into those norms. They were required to follow them. And so that stabilized the system. It stabilized the processes by which legislation could occur. Um, Disintegrating those norms basically means that we can more easily abrogate the patterns, the sequences of patterns by which legislation would be affected. And I will say that both parties have contributed to this. Um, I think of the norms of institutions and the beliefs of a society, the norms of the society, as a thick webbing of interdependency. And in our system, um, you know, we've kind of taken a machete to that webbing and sliced through some of the strands. And I would say that the Democratic Party has held the machete at times, and they've wiggled it around and they've moved it and they've sliced through some of the strands. Um, but the Republican Party in the last several decades, starting with Newt Gingrich and up till now, they've taken that machete and they've wielded it wildly sometimes, slicing through many of the norms, destabilizing the entire system to the point where it's become dysfunctional. Um, and there's kind of the question that we have right now is which strands are going to be sliced through going forward? If the Republicans hold that machete, they're going to slice through the ones above that core of stability so that it can drop to the ground and the core will shatter and the political system will shatter. If the Democrats are wielding it, they can choose strategically, if they have the guts to do it, to slice through the bottom strands so that the buoyancy of the strands above can pull our democratic republic to a higher system of achievement, a higher system of fulfillment, and make the whole process more effective than it ever has been before. But it's not going to be the same. That's for sure. One thing is certain. Our system is changing fundamentally. Our unwritten constitution is going to change fundamentally. If we don't slide into authoritarianism, then we're going to have a better democratic republic than we have ever had before. If we succeed in preserving it, we will move forward in society by leaps and bounds. But I don't want to get emotional. Sometimes I do get emotional about this stuff. But but if we slide into authoritarianism, if the Republicans wield that machete and they slice it and shatter our system, and we slide into authoritarianism, I don't think we will recover. Not in my lifetime, and probably not in yours. Give me a moment.
Yeah, it does. It does often feel like, I mean, obviously you, like, I mean, it's shown like through you being emotional here. I mean, like I think about this stuff, but it doesn't end up affecting me in this way, and that I think a large part of that is that we're young. We don't like as much as you can talk about these things, as much as me and Jazz and everybody here has knowledge about these things. Um, we can talk about it and it really won't mean anything.
Yeah.
In the same way that like a child can't grasp the feeling of middle-aged. Like it's something that we can talk about, but as I said, having old men on the show, right? That it provides like a very unique insight into how, like, cuz me and Jazz are idealistic liberals. We can say stuff like, just raise the minimum wage, and we can understand the effects of that, but we really don't understand like the what's the word for this, scope, I suppose, of like these kinds of topics. It ends up kind of getting lost because we're so
Impact.
young. Yeah, the impact. Yeah, that's actually much better. It's because we're so, I wouldn't say naive. I would just say it's something that's impossible
Unexperienced.
to understand. Yeah, yeah. It's like how like humans can't think about their own death properly because that's like you just kind of don't understand. I think this is a kind of similar situation, like where
Oh,
we can think about these things and understand them, but at their core we don't know anything about it. It's like Plato's
thank
cave.
you. Yeah, you've read The Republic?
Plato's. I thought Plato's cave. I don't know, man.
It's in The
But
Republic. Yeah,
it's in the Republic. I think this
yeah.
is like a thing that. Oh, it is in the Republic. Okay, no, okay, no. This is something that I just know about.
That's cool.
Um, outside of that, because I
Yeah,
think
I've
it's a
heard of
very
that
interesting
outside of
thought experiment.
that as well.
Mhm.
I've
Plato's
told
cave
you
is
about
a
it.
good thing.
I've told Jazz about it before, but that
Wow,
was
Jazz ignoring his
yeah.
dad for real.
So thank you for taking over for a minute there, Derek. Yeah, so even in your lifetimes, I don't think it will recover. It's not impossible that it will, but it's unlikely if authoritarianism really roots itself and situates itself effectively.
I will
Uh,
go back to Perth.
and
Easy wins.
that will suck for you guys because from my perspective, and I probably won't choose to talk about this part tonight, the consequences of authoritarianism. But from my perspective, you all suffer economic decline, in effect. I mean, the society will suffer economic decline under authoritarianism compared to the system that we have now. In my opinion, that's speculative assertion, but I believe that that's the way it will play out for reasons that I probably will save for another podcast. I was going to talk about that a little bit tonight, but I've taken so long, I'm going to save it for another podcast. But yeah, I don't think that you will recover democracy in your lifetimes, and I think the consequences of that are dire. I
Mhm.
do believe that there are off ramps by which democracy can be recovered within the first several years, maybe the first decade, after we lose democracy and slide into authoritarianism. But after that, it's probably not going to be recovered for a very long time. As I said, most of history is about authoritarianism and the success of sustaining authoritarian systems. not the success of sustaining democratic processes. So I think that there's a lot at stake for you guys. So, but that bothers me. I mean, I am also an idealist. I'm a pragmatist as an idealist. I mean, I like pragmatic idealism more so than um, utopian idealism. I like to understand how things work and then move society. I prefer to see society move plausibly in a direction of improvement with idealistic objectives in mind, insofar as they have pragmatic um, grounding to them. So, yeah, it bothers me to see that as a potential thing that will occur during the last part of my life. Not something that I ever expected to see when I was younger. It never occurred to me that there was any such threat in our country. When I was a graduate student, I never imagined that we were under such a threat, that we would see such a threat in my lifetime. As a graduate student, I studied political belief systems in part, and um, I understood pretty well that Americans, by and large, within the population as a whole, um, did not have any really deep attachment to democracy. That they had learned the platitudes of democracy, they had learned the mythology of democracy when they were growing up. They learned stuff in elementary school. It was as real to them as Paul Bunyan tales, um, or Johnny Appleseed tales, or things of that sort, mythology. First grade, we'd hear about Abraham Lincoln, walking a mile to return a penny, or George Washington not telling a lie after chopping down the cherry tree, or whatever. And then as you would get older, you would hear stuff that was more related to the system, but it was still mythologized. Um, it was not the reality of our political system. Again, I don't know how much you guys get in the civics classes that you take, but um, some, but I mean, I don't, but it was never taught at a level of depth in our society where people were deeply committed to the process of democracy, because they never really understood it that well. Um, and so I understood that way back when, right? But that didn't make me fear for the stability or the persistence of democracy within my lifetime, because I believed that the political elites had a consensus of agreement amongst themselves that would sustain the system. Um, and that has the history I described earlier of the economic elites as political elites fighting with each other factionally, forming majority coalitions and striving to reorganize those coalitions favorably for themselves strategically, making choices within the structure of processes in which norms were adhered to and procedures and rules followed ritualistically to achieve substantive outcomes, and that they were open to electoral outcomes which would alter the majority coalitions in a way that they would sometimes win and sometimes lose. So I believe that that consensus of agreement among political elites was pretty profound, and it really was up until not that long ago, not that many years ago. It started breaking down in the 90s. It started breaking down way more dramatically after President Obama was elected. And so that commitment to the norms of the political system itself, the consensus that majoritarian rule within Congress had to be upheld, that majoritarian rule within the electorate had to be upheld, um, has been abandoned by some of the political elites now, because they are not characteristic of the elites of old. And that has to do with the sociodynamics that we'll talk about in another podcast. How did we get to that point? How did we get to the point where we're on the cusp of authoritarianism rather than the preservation of our democracy? So that story we'll say for later. But what I was emphasizing a few moments ago, was the idea that um, that our norms, when adhered to, structure and limit what is possible within the legislative bodies. And they were set up in a way that the procedures and rules allowed for majoritarian rule to be successful, allowed for policies to be implemented and tried out. And if they failed, then that majority would no longer be the majority, and revisions could occur. Um, And so once we start having a disintegration of those norms, we start picking and choosing the procedures and rules that we want to be loyal to because they are the ones that are most strategically beneficial to the outcome that we want, not because we believe that the system functions well and that we need it to keep functioning well for our benefit and for the benefit of everybody else, but because we want this outcome. And if we no longer adhere to those norms and we choose to ignore that procedure and be allegiant to this procedure, emphasize this procedure, we can get different outcomes. And that's a matter of strategy. So once strategy of which norms to adhere to, which procedures to follow become the primary mechanism by which outcomes are achieved, then you have a destabilized system. And that is what has happened to our institutions. In particular, that's what's happened to our Congress in the last several decades. And we'll talk more about that in more detail later in another podcast. Um, so I'm going to skip some of this stuff because I don't want to make this last as long as it will last if I go through the details of the disintegration of our norms over the last 30 something years. Um, I will say this, though, that very briefly, I'll say that um, we've had changes. The, without going into too much detail, what I said earlier was that slavery is the primary institutional force that caused us to get to where we are. But the more specific division within our society that has put us where we are right now is the potential for our society to have a new emerging consensus. I am of the age that I'm not in the old consensus, but I'm of the age that many of my uh, peers are in the old consensus. And the old consensus is one which was much more tolerant of bigotry of all types. And the new consensus is one which is much more tolerant of social differences between individuals. Um, and if that consensus emerges as predominant within the system, then we will restore, under different norms, different procedures and rules, we will restore a stable political system. But right now, we're at a point of close division between the old consensus and the new consensus. There is no consensus. We're in a period of dissensus where we do not have a set of beliefs that are predominantly agreed to by a large majority of the populace, where we have a set of attitudes and opinions and points of view that prevail over most of the citizens. And that dissensus, that lack of consensus, is what has put us in such a vulnerable state right now. Um, but because of that, well, part of the reason why we have that, let me see, let me put it a different way. Because that has been an ongoing process over a period of time, because it reflects social dynamic, social, cultural, and social, economic, and social political changes over a period of time. Um, we have had changes in the composition of our parties and the makeup of our parties. They used to be much more overlapping ideologically, and they're much more polarized now, so that the parties are more distinctive from each other now than they used to be. So that you have very little overlap. You have Joe Manchin, and that's the overlap, right? So there's very little overlap between Democrats and Republicans. As the parties have become more polarized, you've had a reduction in the collegiality between members of Congress. Back in our history, we had periods of time in which there was no collegiality, where there were fisticuffs. Early in our republic, when it was first getting its unwritten constitution developed, in the first few sessions of Congress, you had people fighting it out on the floor of the House of Representatives between Federalists and Democrat Republicans, Jeffersonians and Federalists. So, I mean, we didn't always have a history of collegiality. That was something that developed under a long period of consensus, the old consensus. But we've lost a lot of our collegiality just during these last few years with the polarization of the parties. But a lot of the norms enforced collegiality. And a lot of the collegiality enabled compromises and cross party efforts to work together on solving problems. There's more detail I need to go in on that, but I just want to just mention that as a quick hit. Um, let's see. I'm going to skip here. All right. I think we all know, when you guys talked about it in your first podcast, about the dysfunctionality within the Senate. Um, Without going into too much depth on that, I'm just going to point out that it is a bizarre choice to emphasize a procedure that makes no sense in the history of the Senate as a legislative body. It is a violation of the norms that put us in a position where the filibuster rule has made the Senate effectively, substantively non functional. It cannot fulfill its written constitutional obligations any longer. Its written constitutional obligations require it to pass substantive legislation, and it can't do it. It can only pass reconciliation bills. So one fraction of legislative acts can be passed by majoritarian coalitions within the Senate right now, because the filibuster rule prevents any other substantive legislation from being passed. Um, and that is bizarre, because the filibuster was conceived, when I grew up and learned the mythology of democracy, as the determined debate, the determination of an individual to speak incessantly, like I'm doing tonight, um, uh, in behalf of a particular point of view that they favored for an incredibly long amount of time, in order to prevent that legislation from passing, because they felt very strongly about the legislation. This practice, it really was always about, you know, um, states' rights, or preserving apartheid or oppression within the South. That was the way in which the filibuster was used in historical actuality for almost all of its uses. But it was about prolonging debate. So the filibuster, the original concept of the filibuster, was about prolonging debate. Um, to show you how breaking down the norms can cause a picking and choosing of rules, a reshifting of what rules are applied and how they're applied, um, and can perversely turn everything on its head. Let's just talk about what the filibuster is used for now. So after that norm, so we had a norm for all of our Senate history of not filibustering, except for very rare circumstances, where the individuals who filibustered thought a lot was at stake. The Southern senators who filibustered civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation and other legislation of that sort, they thought a lot was at stake. They thought their culture was about to be devastated by civil rights legislation, allowing blacks to go into public buildings and sit near whites, or you know, be able to be educated in schools where white children were educated, share in the use of public pools and other facilities, eat with whites in restaurants and not have to go in through the back door, etc. All of the things that they prized as cultural conservatives of the South in favor of an apartheid system. They thought all of that was at risk, and it was, you know, psychologically devastating to them to see that at risk, so they filibustered. Well, except for those rare circumstances, the filibuster was never used, because there was a consensus among the political elites that majoritarian coalitions should succeed and should be able to substantively pass the legislation that they had organized through bargaining and compromise with one another as factions, going back to our earliest history of our political system, that enabled it to sustain itself long enough to evolve the way that it has. But that's not the norm that people adhere to now. They're not allegiant to that norm. Now they use the filibuster not to prolong debate, but to prevent debate. The way that the filibuster is used now almost always is to prevent the beginning of debate. It takes 60 votes now within our current system before debate on an issue can begin to occur. Once upon a time, part of our democratic mythology was that the Senate was the greatest deliberative, the greatest, I'm sorry, let me restate that. Once upon a time in our democratic mythology, it was asserted that the Senate was the greatest deliberative body in the world. You've heard Senator Manchin say that if you watch the news. From time to time, he will say, the filibuster, something we got to uphold. The Senate is the greatest deliberative body in the world. Hogwash. It is the least deliberative body in the world as a legislature. There is
Haven't
no
heard
other
somebody say
legislature in the
hogwash in years.
Bullshit.
Okay, there we go.
There is no other legislature in the world in any democratic republic where you can filibuster to prevent a debate. And yeah, that is the way the filibuster is used in our system now. It is absurd. It is a perversion of the concept. It has turned the system on its head to obstruct any kind of substantive legislation from being performed on the basis of majoritarian coalitions. It is outrageous. It is a violation of the written constitution of the duties of the Senate, and they can't get 50 votes to change that rule. It is an outrage that will probably push us into authoritarianism. And at what value will the filibuster rule be then, when those norms have disintegrated to the point that we slide into authoritarianism? The Senate will have the significance of what one former vice president referred to as the value of the vice presidency. It will have the value of a warm bucket of spit. It will be meaningless under an authoritarian system. It doesn't matter what procedures or rules people may be allegiant to, what norms they choose right now. If we slide into an authoritarian system, the legislative body will be a rubber stamp, as it has been in every other authoritarian system. The procedures and rules are the ones that will be followed to get the outcome of the dictator who's in charge at that time, the autocrat who's ruling the system at that moment. And none of the senators will matter one whit. And it will not matter one whit whether they think they're in the greatest deliberative body in the world or the least deliberative body in the world. The system is broken because we have abandoned, the political elites have abandoned their norms and allowed absurd application of rules and procedures strategically chosen to achieve particular outcomes to dominate the system. It is ridiculous. I've already talked about the Supreme Court and their hyperactivism. I'm going to skip that over. We might go into more detail in a later podcast. Let's see. I think I've talked about a lot of this, except for the specifics of how we can lose our system over the span of the next two elections, given the way the last election played out. So let me go through that. So in the 2020 presidential elections,
A lot of stuff happened.
yeah, so basically the way it worked was,
Oh wait, actually, hang on. I'll let Anthony bring up his thing now before we do the 2020 presidential election. His thing on his graph. So I'm gonna invite you to speak, Anthony, and then if you still want to talk about that now, okay, cool.
I can't see any of that stuff. So I
Yeah,
don't know if
yeah. You see on the left side of your screen how there's a bunch of like text channels for like words. Click on the one that says resources,
Okay.
and then you see that black graph.
Okay.
That's what he's gonna talk about.
Okay.
So a little bit of context for the graph. So we were given a briefing about 3 months ago, not talking about just the decrease of democracy worldwide. And this is from Freedom House, just a nonprofit rating freedoms, specifically civil liberties. And the United States has been dropping since about 2010. I kind of want to get your perspective on this and see if it's kind of something where people tend to favor authoritarian regimes, whether it's okay or not, or what you think the cause of that could be.
Yeah. So I think probably I probably made it pretty apparent that I do think that we are sliding. We are back. They call it sometimes backsliding from democracy. And I think that if we backslide far enough, we will find ourselves in the pit of authoritarianism. But yeah. So what's the other country that dropped down? Looks like France. Okay. Yeah, I can understand that too. And Italy's still struggling. Okay. So, yeah, I think we're at risk, but I don't know exactly how they constructed this graph. That's worthwhile for me to look into, so I can try to see the methodology by which they constructed it. So thank you for presenting that, and I'll try to look that up before the next podcast and see how they put that together. But yeah, I think that 2010 is a marker. So 2010 represents what? It represents a massive, I don't want to get into the weeds on this, but it represents a massive blunder by the Democratic Party in trying to advance their liberal agenda with respect to universal health care.
This was the Tea Party, correct?
Well, yeah, the Tea Party came out of that, but the blunder was that they delayed it so long. Again, it was another conservative Democratic senator, moderate conservative Democratic senator, who was kind of the stopping point in getting it done sooner, was Senator Baucus. But I believe was the one. I don't want to make a mistake on that, but it could have been a different. We had a couple more conservative senators back then, but I believe that it might have been Baucus that was the one that slowed down the Affordable Care Act being written and completed. But the big blunder that they made was that they delayed its implementation at the behest of a lot of special interests, not surprisingly, health insurance companies primarily. They wanted a delay. The special interests wanted a delay in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So when it was formulated and passed, it was passed with a long delay before it would take effect. That was a massive blunder, politically, strategically, every way, because what that did was to enable a lot of shenanigans with respect to conversations and political campaigning about the effects of the Affordable Care Act or what the expected effects would be. And so there was another election between the idea of passing the Affordable Care Act and its implementation, which meant that during that election, the overwhelming sentiment of the public was that there would be death panels, for instance, and other, nonsense like that, that people would be unlikely to be able to retain their own personal doctors. In fact, very few people had to switch doctors. Not everybody got to keep the exact same doctor, but hardly anybody had to switch doctors. So they had all these criticisms of the Affordable Care Act that were not rooted in reality. And yeah, it inspired the Tea Party movement. And so you would see things like, placards where people in the Tea Party were protesting the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, so to speak, um, in which they would say things like, keep your government hands off my Medicare, which is ironic because Medicare is a government program. It's an entitlement program, which Republicans opposed when it was passed, and some Republicans have tried very hard to dismantle. But you would have these Tea Party conservative elderly people of a little older than my peer group, who were dependent on Medicare for their personal insurance or health insurance, but opposed to Obamacare because they believed that it was going to result in death panels for Medicare recipients, where there would be selections made by panels about who could receive the care if they had cancer and who could not. And consequently, if they couldn't get the care, they would die. Instead, we have a system where a lot of people can't get health insurance. And if they get cancer and die of it, it's often because they didn't get the preventive care or the checkups that they needed before they found out that they had the cancer, even if they can get the care pro bono after it's diagnosed. So the irony is that we had a backward perspective on that, but it was largely based in, false realities about the Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act at the time that enabled the Tea Party to rise and built the enthusiasm of a legitimate Republican majority within the electorate in the midterm election of 2010. But that majoritarian electorate of Republicans, inspired by the Tea Party, elected a lot of nuts to be in Congress and in the Senate. Some of them didn't get elected. There was the woman who had to go on television in Delaware and claim that she was not actually a witch. There was the, candidate, I think it was probably in Missouri, who claimed that women who were raped could stop themselves from conceiving a baby. So there were some nuts who didn't get elected, but a lot of nuts did get elected. And so those people did not get socialized into the norms of the system, the institution of Congress. And so when they didn't accept those norms and they weren't institutionalized into those norms, they weren't socialized into those institutional norms, they had no loyalty to those norms. They had no loyalty to any procedures or rules. And so they were willing to abandon any particular set of procedures or rules that could be effective for substantive legislation to be passed if that was not in their interest. And that is a contributing factor to where we are right now. 2010 is a marker. The erosion, the disintegration of our norms goes back further than that. It goes back to the choices made by campaign advisors in the 1980s of the Southern strategy. It goes back to, the disintegration of norms with the Gingrich Revolution in the House of Representatives in the 90s. But the biggest drop off in our adherence to norms within our congressional institutions was the rise of the Tea Party, the very effective landslide victory of Republicans in 2010 that put into office a lot of people who just had no loyalty to those norms. Um, so yeah, that graph matches that. Where did you get that graph from? You said you were given that graph. Who gave that to you?
Let me find the name of the gentleman to get a briefing. It was a little while ago.
So this was at like a briefing, like
So this was for an event. Let me find it on my Teams again. An event put on by the Air Force Academy, basically a political science event, which had a bunch of speakers coming in. This is really kind of the staple speaker that we had for the event. Let me see if that was actually stated or
That's
not.
interesting. It's okay. I don't, that's enough information for me. I'm interested in that. I mean, I'm interested in. One of the I wasn't going to talk about it in this podcast, but one of the things that matters ultimately is the acceptance of civilian authority over the military has been an important part of our unwritten constitution. Um, and the refusal by the military to obey unlawful orders. There have been times in our history when the military did participate in, um, well, in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, the military participated in the quelling of strikes by striking workers, whether they were unionized or not. Um, and sometimes they were put down by the U.S. military, sometimes by militias, sometimes by state militias or whatever. But for a very long time, we've had a history of the military staying out of civilian matters and abiding by the civilian orders, refusing unlawful orders. And part of the reason why we were able to save our system was because there were enough people in the military who, whether they were Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, were committed to that. We're committed to that ideal. And simply were not going to abide by any dictates they got from Trump or any of his appointees in the Defense Department to unlawfully contribute to a coup. So yeah, I'm glad that they're doing that kind of stuff and they're talking to you about that kind of stuff. It's really important for the military academies to socialize the military students, the students that are going to be comprising our officer corps in the future. It's important for them to be socialized into the value that they have within our unwritten constitution, our system of government, by adherence to those kinds of norms and principles of democracy. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I can't get
Um,
back. Go ahead. Were you going to say something?
oh no, as that was your topic, and glad to hear your perspective on that. I'll get back to you with the name once I find it.
Okay.
I'm still
I don't
curious.
know, Jazz. I don't know how to go back to the general screen on this. I guess I'll leave it the way it is. I
It
like the
doesn't
other screen.
matter.
I like the other screen because I could see when like Keenan left and came back and stuff like that.
Well, you would just on the bottom left, you see the Sandy Socratic Seminar. You just click on that again.
I can't get
yeah,
this
look at
F
that.
out.
We made all the channels over here.
I'll
This will
do it.
take
Hang
care of
on.
it.
That's all right. Don't worry about it. All right. So, where was I at? So let's see. Okay. So in the 2020 presidential election, um, I don't think that we were going to have Trump's plan work out. So there briefly the idea. Oh, thank you. So briefly, the idea was that if they could get the House and the Senate to disagree on which electoral slates to accept. So the idea was, all right, Derek, did you need me to review the electoral college procedure or not? Do you
Uh,
understand how it works as somebody who grew up in Australia?
does anybody else here understand how it works?
I mean, the basics of it?
Jazz. I mean, okay, the basics of
I'm
it.
sorry, what? I'm back.
No, like, do you know how the electoral college? Does anybody?
Yeah. No, I know how the electoral college
Okay,
works.
okay. Austin, do you know how the electoral works? I'm assuming. Okay, what I gather is that it seems to be like a essentially like a representative system.
Yeah, so the way
Here,
it worked
hang on.
originally.
I'm inviting Austin to speak because he requested to speak. And I think he probably has something to say in the electoral college.
He's just gonna say
Austin, you have
yes
to
or
accept
no,
the
dude.
invite. Oh my god. Thank you, Austin, for not accepting my invitation.
All right. Well,
Declined.
Oh wait, he just said something. He said, "Wait,
wait,
how?"
did you do
Oh,
it last time?
you've done this before. I don't know, Derek. Do you know how to accept the invite?
No, I'm the. Okay, it's fine.
Just say yes or no in the chat, or whatever. Unless, oh wait, he's up. Okay.
Oh,
Let's see.
Yeah, I was just because like
Uh,
I don't know how many people actually know how it works because I definitely don't.
electoral college, isn't it just like so each state has um like these number of electors and uh like if a state like votes for um a certain candidate, then all of their electoral votes go for that candidate.
Yeah.
And like the number of electoral votes that a state gets is two from the Senate plus the House.
What the
Yeah.
hell?
Yeah, so
yeah.
yeah, so basically every state has a number of votes. It equals the number of House of Representatives. It equals the number of representatives they have in their delegation to the House, and that plus 2 senators. So, if you have a state with 11 House members and 2 senators, you get 13 electoral college votes. So then basically the electoral college is composed of people who basically volunteer or are selected to be in the electoral college, and they're the ones who actually go through the process of voting for the president. It wasn't intended to be like it is right now when it was formed, because remember, they didn't want a democracy. They wanted an elite controlled system. And so the idea was the state legislatures would choose the electors, and then the electors would choose the president. And they didn't even anticipate, and even in that respect, they didn't even anticipate that the electors would agree on a majority, would come to a majority agreement on a particular person. At first, they didn't even expect that, except with respect to Washington, they did. They knew it would be unanimous. But after Washington, they did think that there would be enough variety of candidates and enough factions that there would be no majority in the Electoral College. And so then, if there's no majority in the Electoral College, it would revert to the House, and then the House of Representatives would choose the president. That all got reformed over time. But the specifics are that the electors or the electoral slates from each state are the ones who cast their ballots in their states for the president. And those are the votes that get counted on January 6th, or got counted on January 6th last year for determining who the president would be. So you knew what the outcome of the election was with respect to the popular vote. You knew what the outcome of the election was supposed to be with respect to the assignment of electoral votes based upon the states and the rules they had in place for the assignment of votes. In other words, most states are winner take all. So whichever presidential candidate wins a plurality in that state gets all of the electoral college votes for that state. There are 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, that are different. The winner of the statewide vote gets the 2 votes that represent the senators, and the other votes are determined by the plurality in the congressional districts. So in Maine, they have 2 congressional districts. So if one goes for Biden and one goes for Trump, Trump gets 1 electoral vote, Biden gets 1 electoral vote, and then whoever wins the state as a whole gets the other 2 votes out of the 4 that are available. Same thing in Nebraska. So Biden or a Democrat could win Omaha, the largest city in Nebraska, but they would not win the other 2 congressional districts in that state. So that allows a couple states to divide them up. All the states could do that if they wanted, but in order to magnify their potency, their power, they're all the rest of them are winner take all. So anyway, a candidate wins the most votes in the state, they get all the electoral college votes for that state. the electors are the ones that you're technically voting for when you go and vote for Biden or Trump. On your ballot, you choose Biden or Trump, but in effect, literally, technically, you're choosing the electors. You're voting for the electors. You're voting for the entire slate of electors for that state. So all of the people from Texas who, if you voted for Biden, all the people who were on the slate of people who promised that they would vote for Biden as an elector are the people you're literally voting for.
This
Same
is
thing
the
if you,
worst system ever created. How does this make any? Okay, no, I understand how it makes sense in the terms of republic, but this does not make any sense, any semblance of sense in the terms of a democracy.
we can't get it revised because
It's in the Constitution.
well, no, we could do a constitutional amendment, but right now Republicans think it's in their favor to have it.
Yeah,
So
realistically, can we do a constitutional amendment?
yeah, but I mean, you got to get 3/4 of the states to pass
Yeah,
it, and if the Republican states don't want to pass it, then they won't pass it, right? So
exactly.
so getting a constitutional amendment passed is not easy. So unless you're trying to revoke prohibition, then it's easy, and it can happen in record time. But
Yeah.
otherwise, getting a constitutional amendment is difficult. Um, so I mean, the ERA is still out there. I don't think it expired, and it could still be passed. But that was like Congress authorized that as an amendment that could be passed by the states and added to the Constitution in the early 1970s, the Equal Rights Amendment, and it still hasn't passed. So women still don't have equal rights in our country, constitutionally speaking, within the written Constitution. However, there have been Supreme Court precedents that have enhanced their rights close to equality. Anyway, that's off the topic. But um, where was I at? So the electoral college. So the electoral slates then are what get counted in order to determine who the president is. And on January 6th of last year, it was the electoral slates. There were their votes that were going to be counted in order to determine who had a majority of the electoral college votes in order to become president. If no one gets a majority, it goes to the House. If there is a dispute about the electoral college slates, whether it's a legitimate slate or whether some other slate should be accepted as more legitimate, then that goes to the House and Senate. They separate, as they did last year, to debate whether a particular slate is the legitimate slate or not. And when they conclude, if both House and Senate both come to a conclusion that a particular slate is the correct slate, then those electoral votes get counted. They did that last year. They were in the early stages of that debate within the separate chambers in the House and the Senate. They were in the early stages of that debate when the insurrection began. So when the mobs started to flood into the Capitol building, they were in the early stages. Forgot who was speaking in the Senate that got cut off in the middle of his speech because they had to evacuate the Senate. So they were in that process of debating which electoral slate was the legitimate electoral slate because Republicans wanted to claim in certain states that the slates that were voting for Biden were not legitimate and that the slates of people who would have voted for Trump should be chosen instead. Um, they ended up finishing that debate late at night after the Capitol had been cleared out. So late into the night, into the wee hours of the morning, they finished that process and voted on the slates. And then they didn't really continue as far as they were. If they had been able to do it during the daytime and through prime time, they would have drawn it out state by state by state for a number of states. But under the circumstances after the insurrection, they were a little bit chastened, and they decided that maybe that wasn't such a good idea to draw it out state by state. So they did a little bit of a debate on Pennsylvania or something. I don't remember. No, it couldn't have been Pennsylvania. I'm not sure which one because that would have come later in the count, I think. So I'm not sure which one. Arizona, maybe. But they ultimately decided on the correct slate of electors, the Biden electees, because he actually did win the state by a plurality of the vote. And so Biden became the president-elect, or became the president. He was already the president-elect in our common terminology, became the president-elect officially at that point, and then on the 20th of January, he became the actual president. So that's how the Electoral College votes. I kind of needed to review that so that you'd understand what they were doing. Trump's plan was to try to get first, his plan was to try to get Pence to reject the Biden slates of electors for various states. with the idea that if that happened, he would be deprived of a majority, and then the vote would go to the House. So if the vote goes to the House, the way it works now is that each state gets one vote. So California gets one vote, and Wyoming gets one vote. So regardless of the population size of the state, they each get one vote in the House. So the delegation for that state, they vote on who the president should be. So whichever one gets the plurality within the state, the entire state casts its one vote for that particular candidate. If a majority of states can agree on one presidential candidate to be elected president, then that person becomes the president. They were trying to get it thrown into the House for that purpose, to try to get that process applied. The idea was that if that process were applied, that more than 25 of the states were controlled by Republican House delegations because of gerrymandering, as much as anything. So the idea was that if they could have a majority of the states vote for Trump, that Trump could be the president again. And since a majority of the states had predominantly Republican delegations, they were hoping that that would happen. I don't think it would have played out like that, even if Pence had gone along with Trump. I think that, the next step basically would have been to choose, like they did, which slate of electors was legitimate. It wasn't really up to Pence, even if he had thought he had the power, and he didn't think he had the power, and he refused to do it. But even if he had thought he had the power, nobody recognized that power. Nobody in the House or Senate recognized that power. So they would have just separated into their chambers like they did and debated about which slate of electors was valid, which was legitimate, and which ones should be counted. Um, and so I think it would have played out pretty much the way it did play out. There were enough Republicans in the House and enough Republicans in the Senate that really wasn't going to be an issue. I mean, the Democrats controlled the House anyway. The Republicans controlled the Senate, but actually, it was yeah, they controlled the Senate because the Georgia election runoff had been the day before, but those guys hadn't been sworn in yet, I don't think. So Republicans technically still controlled the Senate on January 6th. But there were a few Republicans who believed enough in our system of government that they were not going to vote for an illegitimate slate of electors in states that obviously Biden had won, where he had won the majority of the vote. So there were just a handful of Republicans. Well, I mean, it ended up being a lot of Republicans, but even at the very worst, even if it had been conceived as realistic that Trump could have been elected in that way, there were enough Republicans who wouldn't have allowed for Trump to be elected in that way. Enough of them committed to our system of government at that time. So, but it ended up being most of the Republicans in the Senate also voted to uphold the correct slate of electors, I believe. I don't remember the exact numbers. So I don't think that anything catastrophic would have happened then. Regardless, there are more complications. There was an article you could read from October or September of last year in the Atlantic by Martin Gellman, where he laid out the idea that the state legislatures could usurp the role of the voters in choosing how the electoral slates were determined, um, and that they might attempt to do that in order to get Trump elected. I still think that ultimately enough Republicans in the Senate and the Democrats controlling the House would have prevented that from occurring. Um, but there was a try. They were trying whatever they could in desperate measures for Trump to stay in office. He's not he's not emotionally mature, as we know, and he's not secure psychologically, and he just could not stand. He's narcissistic, and he just couldn't stand the idea that he would suffer a defeat. So he would glom onto any belief and anything that was said to him that was ridiculous in order to believe that he actually won the election. He still believes that, I think. So, uh, so he was determined to try to stay in office by whatever method he could. I'm not so much concerned about that happening last year. I don't think we were on the verge of losing our democracy last year in that respect. I think if Trump had actually won an electoral college majority and had effectively been reelected as president, that over the span of the next several years, we probably would have lost our democracy that way. Um, it's more There were more methods by which we could have prevented that from happening, I think, and I think there's a reasonable chance that it might not have happened, but I think it was a risk that was realistic to consider. Um, because he certainly had autocratic designs, and he certainly had authoritarian nature, and I think that he was getting better in pursuing his autocratic objectives than he was when he was first elected or first became president. So as people around him became better, and as he became more determined and realized more things that he was capable of getting away with, I think he would have probably pursued a more dictatorial path over the next several years if he had still been in power. That was a risk that we faced in the election. We had to have the election outcome the way that it was to be safe in that respect. Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, if you wanted to preserve the democracy, you needed not to vote for Trump in that election because of the risk that we faced. But I think that risk was less than the risk we face now, um, even though I think it was real and significant. Um, so, what we want to understand about what happened last year, though, is this: that there was contemplation of that possibility that was in the Gelman article in the Atlantic from 2020. That state legislatures had the authority to override the vote of the people. Now, that is a matter of that is a matter that pertains to the written constitution. In the written constitution, the state legislatures do have the authority to determine the electors, because in the original conception of our, bizarro skewed republic, that was the point. The point was to have a group of elites choose the president, not the people as a whole. And so the objective there was to have a system where the state legislatures picked the electors then in those days. And so they could use whatever mechanism they wanted to enable the electors to be selected. And ultimately, as we move towards a democratic republic, even before we had the Voting Rights Act, um, and other measures of moving towards democracy, we had, in effect, through the Electoral College, an almost direct election of the president. We had an indirect election through the Electoral College, but with voters in all the states voting for the candidates. Um, all the states chose to change their selection of electors to direct election or indirect election of electoral slates by the voters of the state. All the states have done that, but that's part of the unwritten constitution. It's a long-standing tradition in the unwritten constitution that I think must be preserved for us to sustain a democratic republic. But it is not a part of the written constitution. And the idea here is that the state legislatures can change that at will. They can take that right away from the voters. Now, if they had tried to do it last year, I think there are some complications from a legal standpoint that would have prevented them from actually succeeding in doing it. I won't get into those details because I've taken so long already tonight. But I think that it still would have played out the way that it did ultimately, where Biden would have become president. But it heightened the awareness of Republicans who are prone to authoritarianism, who are interested in moving in that direction and disassembling our democracy. It heightened their awareness that it was something that was possible to do. So now that they have thought about it, I think they're on the path to actually do it. And that is the crux of our concern here. Um, it's constitutionally legitimate, and it would be upheld by the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the Supreme Court doesn't decide which electoral slates get counted. Ultimately, that's Congress. But to the extent that even reasonable Republicans in Congress, like Mitt Romney or Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski or whoever else you might choose to name as a reasonable Republican in that respect, people who definitely would have voted to choose the legitimate electoral slates last year if it had come to that, if it had come to some kind of real conflict over it. Even those Republicans might accept um, electors chosen by state legislatures instead of the voters if the state legislatures act in a timely manner to change the procedures by which the electors are selected. That is to say, if they respect that aspect of the written constitutional power, the prerogative of the state legislatures to do that, then when push comes to shove, and they have to choose between a slate of electors selected by the legislature or a slate of electors chosen by the people, they may choose to abide by the written constitution and abandon our long-standing unwritten constitutional practice of having the population vote for the president. And they may choose in that situation to have a Republican candidate be elected, even if he loses the electoral college vote in the way that we've traditionally thought of it. That is to say, even if the electors were assigned according to the plurality of the vote within the states, even if the Democratic candidate under that system would ostensibly receive a majority vote, if the legislatures choose not to assign those electoral slates to those candidates, um, I think some of the Republican senators who are otherwise pretty reasonable will abandon their unwritten constitution and choose to side with the written constitution and the prerogative of the legislatures to do that. That is a major, major, major threat that we face right now. I think that Republicans in most of the critical states, the critical swing states, are planning to do that. They're on that path. I don't think they're going to do it yet because it would be detrimental to their prospects in the upcoming election. Um, from the standpoint of getting, we talked earlier about how difficult it was for Republican candidates to get a majority of the vote in the country now. That twice Republican candidates had become elected president while the Democratic candidate received the plurality of the votes. That happened in 2000 when George W. Bush was elected, and that happened in 2016 when Trump was elected. So the Democratic candidates got the most votes, but Republican candidates became president because of the Electoral College. Republicans understand the straits they are in with respect to the challenge of getting a majority of the vote or a plurality of the vote in the general populace election. They have relied on the Electoral College as a mechanism by which they can still have a chance of winning presidential elections. But why would they not reinforce and strengthen their hand in that respect? Why would they not increase their probability of winning the presidential election? If they could do so, knowing that if they did that in the swing states and the key states that Democrats would need to win in order to win an election, that they could get a Republican president. Um, in their minds, it's no less legitimate than an electoral college victory when losing the popular vote. In their minds, it's within the written constitution. And if they can succeed that way, then they will succeed that way. That is a determination I think is uh, self evident right now. I might be wrong about that. Maybe they are committed more to the system, the political system that we have had for a long time, more committed to electoral victories of the president than I think they are in various state legislatures. But we'll have to see how that plays out. I think that that they won't pursue changing the selection of electors before the next election because it would be, even among Republican voters, viewed by many of them as reprehensible. It would be viewed as a utter betrayal of our system of government. And even though I don't believe the populace is deeply committed to democracy, I think they would be offended by that kind of an action on the part of uh, the Republican legislatures. So their strategy needs to be wait until after the next election. So after the 2022 elections, if they hold majorities in the critical states, and they are likely to because of gerrymandering, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, um, it's possible that after 2023, they'll have a majority in the Senate. In Virginia, they have a slight majority in the House. They elected a Republican governor there. Um, they have a Republican majority in North Carolina, Florida, Texas, Arizona. All of the Iowa, all of these swing states, some of them have Republican governors too. In the
Telling me
states
I
where they have
applied to UPenn to get gerrymandered, to get put into the liberal box.
in the states where they have Republican governors, they could change the electoral selection process now, any day, because the state legislature could do it. And even if the interpretation, which is debatable, even if the interpretation is that the governor has to sign on to that legislation because the original abdication of their authority to select the electors was done legislatively. In other words, when they went from the legislatures choosing the electors to the people voting for the electors, that was a legislative process, in which case the governor always signed that process, signed the bills. So there's an argument that in order to undo that legislation, they would have to get the governor's signature too. Some would argue that the way it's written in the Constitution, the governor is irrelevant and the legislature can do it on their own. That's debatable. I think the unwritten constitutional interpretation would be that the governor has to agree. And I think that when the electoral slates came before the House and Senate, if there were disagreement on that point, that most people would accept the idea that the governors had to agree. But in North Carolina, not North Carolina, because there's a Democratic governor there, but in Florida, Texas, Arizona, they could change that now anytime they want to. Iowa, they could change that now anytime that they want. But it would be very detrimental to their political prospects in the next election, I think, to do that. So they're holding that option in abeyance to see how things play out. In Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there are gubernatorial elections this year in 2020 and 2022. Those are midterm elections. Midterm elections generally favor the side that's not in presidential power. So midterm elections generally favor, in this situation, will favor the Republican Party. There's less enthusiasm for the party that's in power. They feel like they've got what they want. There's a lot more intensity among voters in the party that's out of power. They feel like, they lost. They got to get their power back. They're much more likely to vote than the people on the side that won. So they have a natural swing towards the out party, the presidential out party in midterm elections. If those Democratic governors don't win re-election in those 3 states, we're done. We're done because there's no possible way for the Democratic candidate to get an electoral college majority if they don't win those states. If Iowa, Arizona, Texas, Florida go ahead and choose by states to select their electors, then the Democratic candidate has to win Virginia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If they lose any of those states, they cannot get an electoral college majority. I believe. I'd have to check the numbers, but I believe that's correct. So any of those governors lose, and they already lost in Virginia. They still have a 1 seat. The Democrats still have a 1 seat majority in the Virginia Senate. But like I said, that comes up for election in 2023. If the Democratic gubernatorial candidates lose in any of those 3 elections, then the legislature in those states, combined with the governor in those states, can coordinate to select. Under the Constitution, they can choose to usurp the power of the people and select the electoral slate themselves. And I think they will. So when that happens, you're guaranteed a Republican presidential candidate being elected, whether or not they lose by 10 or 15 points in the national vote. Won't matter, even if it's a landslide under the old situation. They will be electoral college. They will attain an electoral college majority, and they will be the next president. That's not the end of the matter, but as a practical matter, it is. I mean, you'll still have elections for Senate. You'll still have elections for House. But once you get to that point, the system is likely to collapse. I mean, if you've already replaced all of the individuals who can certify the outcomes of elections in the states where, and you've already gerrymandered effectively to retain power in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, even if you lose the plurality of the vote in those states in votes for state legislative races, which happened. In all those states, the Democrats got more. I believe in all those states, the Democrats got more votes than the Republicans, but the Republicans held on to legislative power in all those states because of gerrymandering. So at some point, you have to imagine that they will implement with congressional power and presidential power fundamental changes to the voting system, more dramatic than anything they're attempting now, that will ensure them that the old consensus will continue to prevail and hold power, and that the new consensus will not emerge as the majority in the system. If it if they leave it up to elections, they're done for the long run. So the choice has to be on their part. If they want to preserve the old consensus as the source of power in our society, they cannot leave it up to elections. Ultimately, even gerrymandering can fail. Um, the 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 young voters, because of their beliefs, their their participation in the new emerging consensus, will ultimately overwhelm even gerrymandering. So in the long run, they just cannot they cannot preserve their power uh, if elections are continued, if they're allowed to continue effectively. If you continue to have meaningful contested elections, I think elections will continue. I think elections will even if we slide into authoritarianism. I think we will have elections 30 years from now, just like Russia has elections. But what do they mean? And I don't think they will be meaningful contestable elections. Um, that's that's the crux of it right there. Um, you will hear people say that the last election in 2020, or this coming election in 2022, or the next election after that in 2024, that any of those elections, or altogether, each of those elections are the most important elections in our history since the 1864 election of Abraham Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War. I agree with that. I think that they are the most important elections since the elections of 1864 and the Civil War. Occasionally, you'll hear somebody say, because these are the first elections which have threatened our democracy since the elections of 1864. I don't agree with that. And the reason I don't agree with that is what I've already told you. We weren't a democracy at that point. Even at that point, we were not really a democracy. Um, the, the font in Democratic and Democratic Republic was bigger than it had been at the start of our new republic, but it was not a democracy. It was not even a republic um, before the Civil War, because it was still a very skewed system. It still was a system that gave extraordinarily disproportionate power to the agrarian aristocrats of the South. So it wasn't even a republic at that point by the modern standard of the term. Fair enough that by the standard of the times you could say that, but even by the standard of the times, it wasn't really a democracy. So we weren't at risk of losing our democracy at that time, and we weren't even at risk of losing our elections at that time. Um, it was still more important than these elections because of slavery. The Civil War, whether we say so or not, was ultimately and fundamentally about slavery. Um, Lincoln may not have thought that it was about slavery at the time that the war began. He thought it was about preservation of the Union and whether states had the right to nullify federal law and secede from the Union unilaterally. And he did not think that they had that right, so he was willing to go to war to preserve the Union. Other elites, including most Republican elites, probably thought similarly to Lincoln in that respect. Lincoln was willing to preserve slavery in order to preserve the Union. The Republican Party basically, you know, was transformed from the Whig Party that preceded it and was a new party at that time. And it was driven by, ideologically, it was driven by the abolitionists, but it wasn't a majority abolitionist party per se. And there were plenty of Republican elites who hated slavery, opposed it, wanted it to be abolished, but wouldn't risk the breakup of the Union over it. And Lincoln was one of those Republican elites. He didn't like slavery. He was opposed to slavery by the time that he became president. He has spoken against it. He had some kind of transformation of his opinions on these matters over time, but he was opposed to slavery by the time he became president. But he was not willing to make an effort to abolish slavery through legislative processes um, if it would risk the breakup of the Union. So he was willing to allow the Southern states to rejoin the Union and preserve slavery. It wasn't until later in his presidency that he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and even that only applied to territories that had actually been taken over by the Union forces. I'm sorry, I got that the other way around. I misstated that. It only applied to the states which had not yet been taken over by the Union forces. So the states that were still effectively in rebellion, um, it applied to those states. Um, so, uh, but the thing is that the southern states, when they seceded, they said that it was about the abolition of slavery. They believed that slavery could not prevail over the long run if they didn't secede from the Union. And so for them, once Lincoln was elected, even though he wasn't trying to eliminate slavery, they saw the writing on the wall, like Republicans nowadays do. They saw the writing on the wall that eventually that they were not going to be in the majority anymore. That the population had shifted so heavily to the north because of immigrants to the United States who didn't settle in the South, where the economy was organized around slavery and plantations and farming. They had migrated to the north, where the society was industrializing. So the population centers were in the north. They were going to keep winning elections. The North was going to win elections, and abolition was going to become the dominant consensus within the North. So it was going to become the prevailing consensus within the country as a whole. They saw the writing on the wall, and they would rather be out of the Union and keep slavery than be in the Union, knowing that inevitably they would lose it. And so, in their resolutions to secede from the Union, they said it was about the preservation of their culture and the preservation of slavery that they were choosing to secede. Once they made that decision, that's what the war was about. So once the southern states chose that the war was over slavery, the war was over slavery, and it had to be ended when the war ended. So from that point forward, that's what it was about. So if Lincoln had lost that election in 1864, I think McClellan was his opposing candidate. He was more conciliatory towards the southern states of the South, and they either would have been readmitted to the Union with slavery intact, or they would have been allowed to separate from the Union and form their own nation with slavery intact. But in either event, the electoral processes that had preceded the Civil War would have continued. So the antebellum electoral practices in the North, which were somewhat more Democratic Republican than the South, would have persisted as they were, and probably maybe you would have gotten faster growth of movement towards the Democratic Republican system that we have now if the two countries had been separated from each other. But in the South, it would have continued like it had been, where it was totally dominated by the agrarian aristocrats. Um, in most states, where there were a few states with less slave owning, with fewer slaves and fewer people controlling a smaller number of slaves because plantations were not effective in those states. Still had slavery, but in those states you might have had more you would have had more robust movement towards a still perverse democracy, in the sense that slaves wouldn't have been citizens and couldn't have participated. But they were somewhat more democratic than the plantation states, or the states that were dominated by plantation economies. Um, so uh, the upshot there is that, yeah, that election was more important because it enabled us to abolish slavery. That's what that election enabled us to do. Since Lincoln won, we finished the Civil War, the Union won the Civil War, slavery was abolished, etc. That's more important than the risk we face of sliding into authoritarianism now, because even if we slide into authoritarianism, we're not going to, in my expectations, we're not going to go back to slavery. So we're not at the same risk of such a depraved society as we had at that time. But we were not going to lose our electoral process at that time. That's the interesting thing, is that, as I said at the beginning of this podcast hours ago, the meaningful contestable elections were the core of our political system. They were the core of how our political system evolved. They were the core of why it was democratic, and why it became a democratic republic. They were the core of how it became resilient through economic and cultural changes over time. It was the core of the system. There were other changes, like I mentioned, but that was the core. Never in our history, including in 1864, never in our history have we come to the point where the elections upcoming will determine whether or not meaningful contestable elections will prevail, whether they will persist. And it seems unlikely that they will persist if we don't take drastic action to preserve our system. That's going to require unanimity among Democrats about breaking the norms to which they have been loyal to so far, in order to preserve overall our political system. If we lose meaningful contestable elections, um, then we will have an authoritarian regime. And, you know, uh, I think that's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about that because I think that that's probably the strategy that Republicans are pursuing right now. I'm not certain that they are. We'll know more in a couple of years, but it seems likely that that's the idea, is to break down our elections. So I think we are about to lose meaningful contestable elections, which will shatter our political system. It's not just a regression of our democratic republic that is at stake. That's been in play for a while. It is true that the loss of meaningful contestable elections will prevent us from recovering progress toward a fuller democratic republic. That is, of course, the objective. The purpose of the authoritarian pursuit is to achieve that objective. But it will do much more than break our democratic republic. It will crush our historical political system, defective as it was, by depriving it of its primary mechanism of evolutionary dynamism. Most of our unwritten constitution will be demolished. Our written constitution will be left vacuous, with parts of it ignored or cited as a matter of convenience, but bereft of any real significance. And that's about all I have to say. Sorry it took so long. I didn't expect it to take that long.
All right, yeah. So, what I'm going to do is that I think a week from now we'll do a follow-up to this one. That's not the part 2. That'll be questions and more information on this. Because I think there was more that Anthony wanted to talk about in terms of education. And then there was stuff Derek wanted to talk about, like with Bernie Sanders and probably other things. And then as I have more people watch it, I'll have them ask their questions.
Well,
before we do like the next part.
If I could have kept it shorter, I think you could probably get more people to listen to it. But because it took as long as it did, I don't think you'll get very many people to listen to it.
Right.
But I'm sorry, there was just a lot to cover.
This was probably not.
I was probably.
I was probably not as efficient as I needed to be.
I think it was fine. I expected it to take a long time. So, but yeah.
Guys has no idea how to end these. He just doesn't know how to end these.
No. I'm not ready to end it yet. I'm gonna ask.
In his picture, it looks like somebody sitting in a chair with his head and his.
He's gonna make you watch Neon Genesis Evangelion.
No,
and I'm like, that's probably what Jazz is thinking here at the end of this podcast.
All right. So, what do you like to do on the beach?
Who, me?
Yeah.
When I was a little kid, I lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, which was on the Gulf Coast side of Florida, and the beach was pretty tame. And, it was warm water, and you could go hang out there and play on the beach. The water itself wasn't very interesting. A couple times, we went across Florida to the east side where the Atlantic is, and went to St. Augustine, where my aunt and uncle had an old-fashioned motel about a block or two from the beach. And so when I was a little kid and we went there, I had an older cousin, quite a bit older, who was really sweet to us. And she would take us to the beach. And what I really liked to do was to dive under the breaking waves. Either dive under the breaking waves just as they were breaking, or I liked to be at their height of the normal size of a small wave, and then I would try to jump up to get my face over the height of the higher breaking waves. That was fun for me. So I like to dive into or jump over the breaking waves.
All right. At some point, we'll have to animate that. I said we, but I mean Derek will have
Good
to animate that.
I hate jazz.
I like to stick my feet in the sand. Is that better?
Okay. That concludes part 1 of this. This will be covered. I'm not sure if the next episode of the podcast will be a follow-up to this, and then I don't know if the one after that will be part 2 of this, or if I'm going to do a topic on the military. We will see. But yeah, I'm now going to regularly do these on Sundays, I think, probably, every week.
Yeah, probably should have started a little earlier, because if we'd started at like 7, it would probably only be 11 o'clock now.
Right, yeah, I might not do these. Well, no, these usually do not last this long, so...
No, that's true.
They only last like about an hour and 15 minutes, so usually it's not that big of a deal. But yeah.
I wasn't the one who said I wanted to do these podcasts. I was requested to do them.
Okay, I'm gonna end the podcast now. Goodbye.
All right.